For many, the thought of prison is enough to keep them on the straight and narrow. But for others, prison is merely a consequence of their chosen lifestyle. And for a select few, prison is nothing more than a challenge, a puzzle begging to be solved. Today, we'll look at some of the more creative escapes in this episode of the infographic show, The Greatest Prison Escapes in History. We're starting off with a classic, fictionalized by Hollywood into the film The Great Escape starring Steve McQueen, though the real story is fraught with far more drama than what could fit on the silver screen. In World War II, the prisoner of war camp known as Stalag Luft III was thought to be the most secure POW camp in Europe. Hundreds of miles southeast of Berlin, it was located deep in enemy territory and featured a host of security features meant to make it difficult to escape from. Along with barbed wire fences, the Germans had sunk microphones 9 feet deep into the soil all along the perimeter in order to detect the sound of digging. The prisoners' huts were all built on stilts, raised up above the ground so any tunnel would be immediately visible. Lastly, the sandy soil made it nearly impossible to dig through, threatening collapse at any moment. Yet none of these things stopped a band of British, Canadian, Australian, French, and American airmen from attempting an escape anyways. The plan was to build 3 tunnels codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. Using only metal silverware and milk tin cans, the prisoners painstakingly chipped away at the building support columns of 3 different huts in order to avoid being seen working underneath them. They accessed their below-floor workspace via a secret trapdoor over which they kept a heating stove permanently lit in order to discourage any Nazi guards from getting too close. In order to solve the microphone problem, the escapees dug their tunnels a whopping 30 feet deep, excavating an astonishing 100 tons of sand, all by hand. To avoid raising suspicion, the excavated sand was concealed in stuffed socks which they would sprinkle discreetly on garden soil being raked by other prisoners. To shore up their tunnel walls, the prisoners stripped 4,000 wooden bedboards and then lined each tunnel with 1,700 blankets to muffle the sounds of digging. They converted discarded milk tins into lamps with wicks made from pajama cords, and burned in mutton fat the prisoners skimmed off the greasy soup they were served. Stealing a few hundred feet of electrical wire, the prisoners even managed to fashion their own work lights, which they plugged directly into the camp's electrical supply. And if that's not enough ingenuity, the prisoners also created an air pump using hockey sticks and other discarded bits of trash, and even built an underground trolley system to transport the excavated sand. On March 24, 1944, the prisoners finally made their escape. Forced to move one by one through the cramped tunnels, barely a dozen managed to make it out per hour, and at one point, a 1-hour blackout during an air raid further slowed the escape attempt. At around 5 a.m., however, disaster struck, with a Nazi guard on patrol nearly falling into the exit shaft of one of the 3 tunnels and discovering the plot. A massive manhunt was mobilized, and eventually the Germans recovered 73 of the 76 escapees. 3, however, would make it to safety. 2 Norwegians, who stowed away on a freighter to Sweden, and a Dutchman who made his way to Gibraltar by rail and foot. A furious Hitler ordered the execution of 50 of the escapees, violating the Geneva Convention. Years after the war, a military tribunal found 18 Nazi soldiers guilty of war crimes for shooting the recaptured POWs, and 13 of them were executed. As one of the largest manhunts in American history, the prison escape of the Texas 7 in December of 2000 made headlines around the world. On December 13, 2000, the 7 inmates convinced a maintenance supervisor to let them skip lunch so they could wax the floors of the maintenance room. Distracting the supervisor, one of the inmates knocked him unconscious with a blow to the back of the head, then undressed him, tied him up, and locked him in an electrical room. During this time, 3 other inmates, 4 prison guards, and 9 supervisors wandered into the room, and incredibly, all were subdued by the inmates. That's when the Texas 7 put their plan into action. By impersonating various supervisors over the telephone, the inmates got out of 12 head counts, and then making their way to the gatehouse, incredibly conned their way inside by pretending to be monitor installers. Once inside the gatehouse, the prisoners subdued the lone guard and got his firearm along with a few other weapons from a weapons cache. Then the prisoners opened the back gate and drove their way out in a stolen pickup truck, launching a multi-state manhunt that would be one of the largest in American history. Eventually found, thanks in part to the television program America's Most Wanted, the prisoners even demanded a TV appearance before they would agree to surrender. In the end, no such appearance would be granted, and all of the 7 were brought back into custody. There's never been a more iconic prison in history than Alcatraz, and naturally it is the setting for our greatest prison escape story. A lifelong criminal criminal, Frank Morris was serving a 10-year stint for bank robbery when he broke out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, only to be recaptured a year later and sent to Alcatraz. Ranked in the top 2% of the population in intelligence and with an IQ of 133, Morris paid no heed to Alcatraz's reputation as an inescapable prison and quickly went to work developing an escape plan. Partnering with brothers John and Clarence Anglin and car thief Alan West, the 4 prisoners discovered an unguarded utility corridor that ran just behind their cells, which housed a ventilation shaft to the roof. Utilizing scavenged saw blades, spoons stolen from the commissary, and even a home-built drill made from the motor of a broken vacuum cleaner, the 4 gradually widened the ventilation duct opening in each of their cells. The holes were concealed using cardboard and paint, and Morris's accordion provided cover for the sound of their work. Once inside the utility corridor, the 4 climbed to the roof of their cell block and set up a small workshop there. Using stolen and donated materials, the 4 made makeshift life preservers using 50 raincoats from a design they had seen in an issue of Popular Mechanics. They also used the raincoats to create a 6 by 14-foot rubber raft and used a small accordion-like concertina they stole from another inmate as a bellows to inflate the raft. Their paddles were made from scrap wood and stolen screws. On the night of June 11, 1962, the men began their escape. Of the 4, though, Alan West was unable to leave his cell, having used cement to shore up the crumbling concrete around the vent opening in his cell, which threatened to give him away. Once dried, the cement narrowed the escape hole and fixed the steel grill in place, and by the time he had re-widened his hole and removed the grill, the others had already left without him. The other 3 inmates climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof, then hauled their homemade life preservers and raft 50 feet down a kitchen vent pipe to the ground, and then scaled 2 12-foot barbed wire fences. Somewhere along the northeast shoreline of Alcatraz, where the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers had a blind spot, the men inflated their raft and then rode into the dense fog, trying to reach Angel Island 2 miles to the north. In the ensuing manhunt, police would recover one of the paddles and bits of raft and life preservers, but no sign of the men. With their stated plan having been to steal clothing in a car and no vehicle or clothing thefts reported in the area after the escape, the police finally concluded that in all likelihood, the men drowned in the strong currents and frigid waters of San Francisco Bay.
The date is March 1943, and in a prisoner of war camp inside occupied Poland, Royal Canadian Air Force pilot William Ashe approaches the camp's toilet facilities. A single POW leans against the latrine's doorways, casually keeping watch on the rest of the camp. The POW nods at Ashe as he approaches and allows him to enter the small, squat latrine. Inside are 2 rows of toilets built in the classic Roman style. 9 boxed-in seats ring the sides of the room and consist of nothing more than concrete boxes with no dividers between them. The wooden seats led down to a large concrete pit underneath, where hundreds of prisoners relieve themselves into every day. A small hole leads to a huge sewage pit, which is drained every week into the waiting truck of a local farmer who uses the camp's waste to fertilize his fields. As Ashe enters the building, he spots 2 men seated at the far seats, who return his nod of greeting. One of them stands and lifts the seat he was just sitting on, revealing a hole in the concrete that's just barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. The stench of human waste wafts up from below, powerful enough to make the men's eyes tear up as they fight the urge to vomit. Yet, powering through the horrid assault on their nostrils, the men climb down into the hole one by one. As they land, a few inches of wastewater splash urine and feces all over the men. But they ignore it as they turn their attention to the task at hand. The men remove a panel that's been made to look like a false wall and reveal a small chamber beyond, which has been carved from the frozen soil itself. Using candles made of boot strings and margarine held in a tin dish, the men join 3 others who are already waiting there and strip down to their underwear. One man sits at a bellows made of old leather kit bags, and as he works it, he pushes air through a pipe made of old cans into the tunnel which the crew has been digging for weeks now. 2 men now move down into that tunnel while the remainder stay behind to handle the soil that the diggers displace in their dig. The entire crew is split up into shifts, with some men taking turns digging while others man the bellows, dispose of the dirt, or stands watch above. Disposal of the dirt is accomplished by pushing the dirt through the sump directly onto the toilets above and into the huge sewage pit beyond. Once a week, Polish farmer Franciszek Lewandowski arrives at the camp and pumps the sewage out for use on his farm. Yet Lewandowski has begun to notice more and more dirt in the wastewater. Before he has a chance to complain to the Nazi guards, though, another prisoner, Józef Birks, a young Czechoslovakian, informs Lewandowski of the escape plan. The Polish farmer is no fan of the Nazis, especially after their invasion and occupation of his home, and keeps the plan a secret, doing his part to aid the would-be escapees by dutifully carting away the soil. As the digging team finishes its work for the day, the third team enters the tunnel and begins the job of shoring up the tunnel walls and ceiling. The tunneling work, carried out with nothing more than cut-out aluminum cans, is dangerous work, and the tunnel is under constant threat of collapse. Each day that the tunnel extends further and deeper, the men require just a little bit more courage to enter the dark tunnel, not knowing if that's the day the tunnel will collapse and trap them with little or no hope of rescue. It's the job of the third team then to enter and shore up the sides and ceiling as best they can, using wooden boards taken from their barracks and even the bed frames themselves. The boards make for a rudimentary shoring but help add a little bit of safety to the entire endeavor as they shore up the freshly dug length of tunnel. The men also extend the air pipe, which brings in oxygen to the tunneling crew. They use powdered milk cans for the job, cutting them so that they fit end to end. The air they pump is from the latrine itself and fetid with the stench of human waste, but it brings life-saving oxygen as the men dig deeper and further into the earth. To expedite the process of digging, the men have developed an ingenious system to move freshly dug earth to the latrine sump for disposal. 2 lengths of rope extend down the tunnel, and at one end is an empty sack. The diggers fill the sack with dirt and then give the rope a sharp tug, which causes the man at the halfway point to begin hauling on the rope to bring the dirt out of the tunnel. Once it reaches the midway point, that man attaches it to the second rope, whose end he has with him, and then gives that rope a sharp tug. The men at the entrance then drag the sack from the halfway point all the way to the entrance of the tunnel, where the dirt is emptied into the latrine sump. The system is rudimentary and nowhere as near sophisticated as the homemade railroad tracks and trolleys that the men at the Stalag Luft 3 prison complex would use to escape and serve as inspiration for the film The Great Escape. Yet the process saves countless hours of labor, as it takes half an hour to squeeze down the 2-foot by 2-foot tunnel each day. In early March of 1943, the team digging at the end of the tunnel began to dig directly upwards. By their calculations, they've dug several hundred feet past the perimeter fencing, a task which required them to not just dig out from their starting point, but down into the rocky soil to a depth of over a dozen feet in order to avoid the seismic sensors that the Germans have installed to detect digging. Once well out of the fence, the tunnel begins to angle upwards again, and now the men are digging straight up. One of them takes a long stick and pushes it into the ceiling above, feeling resistance for 2 feet before the stick gives way to the top side. The tunnel is finished, and to avoid detection, the last 2 feet of the tunnel will be dug up on the day of their escape. Now the men prepare for their breakout. While the dig teams were working for weeks on the tunnel, Birsk, the young Czech, has been helping secure fake papers for the escapees. To do this, he managed to talk his way into being part of a detail that's taken every week under guard to a produce store in town. There, the prisoner detail buys a few luxuries for the POWs, such as chocolate, cigarettes, and the sorts. They pay for this from the meager wages paid to them by the German government under its obligations to pay POWs for their labor via the Geneva Convention. At the store, a young Polish girl, Stefania Maludzenska, works behind the counter, and it isn't long before she's swooning at Birk's charms. She's been helping to smuggle letters to Birk's family members for months, but now the escapees need her help in far more dangerous work. Stefania has friends who work at Town Hall, and she has them steal official German forms that will serve as a template for the forged identity papers needed by the escapees. Their identity papers will ID the escapees as Polish citizens after their escape, allowing them to bypass security checkpoints and hide their identities as POWs. Yet, for the papers to look legitimate, there's one more thing that's needed: a photograph of each of the escapees to adorn their fake papers. To get these photographs, Stefania takes the biggest risk of her life and helps secure a small camera and film from a Polish laborer who used to be a teacher before the German invasion. Now he's forced to do hard labor and work rebuilding the same roads the Germans themselves bombed in the invasion. And helping the prisoners escape will be his small measure of revenge against the Nazis. The camera and the film is smuggled into camp via a 17-year-old boy who routinely brings a shipment of the prisoners' daily allowance of bread, all hidden safely amongst the loaves. After the prisoners take their photos, the film is then smuggled out through the same young teenage boy who develops the photos himself in a makeshift photo lab inside his parents' tiny apartment. All of these brave Polish civilians assisting the escapees are taking huge risks, and discovery of their involvement would certainly lead to a quick execution. The date for the breakout is set to be March 5th, as those amongst the prisoners with meteorological knowledge estimate that this will be the next moonless night. In order to have the best chance of escape, the men must move under the cover of deepest darkness. And with no moon in the sky, they stand a good chance of being unseen by the perimeter sentries. The men decide that immediately after 5 p.m. roll call, a group of them will head straight to the tunnel and wall themselves in until after lockup at 9 p.m., when the rest of the group will sneak out of their bunks and make their way to the tunnel. A mathematician amongst them calculates that the tunnel will be able to support up to 33 men for 6 hours before the oxygen runs out and the men asphyxiate. The figures and the math are both rough, but it's the best the men have to go on. At 5 p.m. on March 5th, the guards line up the POWs and conduct their daily count. Satisfied that all men are accounted for, they're left alone for recreation time. 800 men move to the recreation ground where a rugby match has been staged in order to help cover the escape attempt. The men plotting their escape conceal clean clothes under their coats, their pockets stuffed with a concoction termed the mixture, a high-energy food made by the prisoners. In each of their pockets are also their identification papers, a map of the region, and a homemade compass. Overhead, gray clouds build up and cold gusts of wind force the German guards to seek what shelter they can inside their guard towers. The men head to the latrine in pairs, and once inside, ditch their overcoats and make their way into the filth below. As the night goes on, the men are relieved to discover that the calculations for oxygen supply were correct. And at last, 9 p.m. rolls around, along with the final group to enter the escape tunnel. The men break through the last 2 feet of dirt at the end of the tunnel and crawl out into freedom. Grateful to leave the smelly, stinking tunnel behind at last, the men break up into groups and head in different directions so as not to draw attention to themselves, posing as travelers. Unfortunately, within the end of the week, all 36 escapees would be recaptured by the Germans, with many sent off to new prison camps. Though the escape ultimately failed, it proved to be one of the most daring and smelliest escapes of World War II, inspiring many heroic attempts by other Allied soldiers throughout the rest of the conflict. World War II was a time of terror that brought out the worst in many. Yet even in the darkest, most desperate times, people joined together to fight against the wicked in positions of authority, even when the consequence they would face was often certain death. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler are 2 such men who fought for what was right, even when all of the odds were stacked against them. They wanted to save others from execution, but first, they'd have to escape from the Nazis' camp they were imprisoned in. They knew that if they were caught, they'd be executed because they were trying to escape from a Nazi death camp. Today, you can say the word Auschwitz and pretty much everyone will know exactly what you're talking about. The concentration camp in Europe, the biggest of those used by Hitler and the Nazis during World War II, a sight of unspeakable horror. The unsuspecting Jewish population from surrounding areas was systematically brought to Auschwitz in the cattle cars of trains. Here in the death camp, they were murdered in gas chambers by the thousands upon thousands. As the Nazis expanded their territory over the war, so too did the concentration camp's operation to accommodate the further influx of victims. It's estimated that in 1944, up to 12,000 Jewish people were killed at Auschwitz every day. These were men, women, and children, husbands and wives and sons and daughters, all surrounded by barbed wire and Nazi guards, and killed mercilessly and without hesitation. Those who made a run for it but failed were publicly executed. Many people entered Auschwitz. Few would leave alive. What's hard to grasp now is that even as late as 1944, many of the details of what went on in the concentration camps weren't well or widely known by the outside world. In fact, massacres carried out in concentration camps were kept secret from almost everyone except those who directly participated in them. Much of the world had no idea just how evil Hitler's final solution was. As Jewish prisoners, though, Verba and Wetzler knew exactly what was happening. They had watched as innocent Czechs were brutally and systematically slaughtered right in front of them. Then came the rumors that the Nazis wanted to start exterminating Jewish Hungarians. Verba and Wetzler vowed to prevent this. They believed that it was their duty to spread the word of the mass killing and to stop the Nazis' genocidal plans. They wanted to warn people, the people boarding the trains to Auschwitz, who often had no idea what awaited them inside the barbed wire fencing. But how would they be able to escape and tell the world what they knew? They searched the camp for a point of weakness and explored plan after plan. Unfortunately, none of them seemed even remotely likely to succeed. Until one day Wetzler told Verba of a possible way to escape based off the ideas of 4 other prisoners. Those 4 intended to hide inside a hollowed-out place in a pile of wood in an area where construction was being done on the camp, where they would wait out the 3 days that guards would be searching for them. Then, once the coast was clear, the prisoners would run toward the south and over the Slovakian border. The 4 prisoners put their plan into action. It went seamlessly and they fled Auschwitz into the country. However, they were caught in a village to the south. Still, it proved that hiding in the wood worked. Wetzler and Verba bided their time, waiting to see if the men who were captured would reveal their exit strategy and set them back to square one. In time, it became obvious that they hadn't. The stack of wood remained untouched and unnoticed. So 2 weeks later, Wetzler and Verba made their own attempt. Once inside the stack of wood, Verba scratched off a message left by the men who had used it in the escape before. The note they had etched into the wood of "kiss your you-know-what" would certainly get them executed. The scratching also helped serve as a minor distraction while waiting out the 3 days. Roll call took place at 5:30, at which time they expected to be missed and to have the guards come looking for them. They waited in the darkness, concealed completely. Then 5:30 came, and no siren went off signaling that anyone was missing. 5:45 passed, and then time ticked on further to 6. The 2 men began to fearfully consider what this could mean for them. They wondered if their location had been given up and those in charge knew exactly where they were hiding. Nervously, they waited longer as the silence continued. Then finally, much later than they had expected, the siren ripped through the night. They heard the sounds of men running and of dogs scampering on the wood piled on top of them. It was a while before it was silent again. They stayed in the wood for a full 3 days and nights without eating or drinking, growing sore from never moving. Finally, the 3rd day was done and they heard the guards giving up on their search. Now was their chance, and they eagerly pushed on the wood. It refused to move. They frantically pushed some more and shoved on it as hard as they could. As they grew frantic, it finally gave way, and they lifted it up off them. They were free in the night, but this was only the very beginning. Over 80 miles of enemy-held territory lay before them before they could make it to their final destination. They took off and promptly got lost in a hostile area. Their plan was to cross the Beskid Mountains to the south of the camp. They ran into a village instead. Day was almost breaking before they could find their way out again, and as it grew light, they found themselves in another small inhabited area. They were out in the open without any shelter, so they were forced to turn to someone living there for help. They knocked on a door and a Polish peasant came who knew exactly who they were and what they wanted. She fed them and gave them advice on how to find the mountains they were searching for. One of her sons was in a concentration camp, and she gave the men what little money she had to spare, which amounted to only about a single British pound. She also wished them luck, which she knew they'd need more than anything. They soon found themselves walking close to Promka, a village filled with soldiers and where the men who escaped before them had been caught. Shots suddenly rang out and bullets hit all around them. They realized that they too had been spotted. The Nazis gave chase and pursued them, their dogs howling alongside them. Wetzler and Verba ran for their lives along the mountainside until they ran into a stream. Despite its freezing temperatures, they jumped into the water, hoping it would conceal their smell. In time, as the 2 prisoners hid in their terror in a ditch, the sounds of the search grew fainter and eventually stopped. It had been a very close call, but they had to continue on. Soon, they came face to face with another peasant. All could be lost in a minute if she chose to turn them in to the Nazis instead of helping them. They had no choice but to trust her though, as they needed directions. With their fate in her hands, she left them and promised a man would return to help them later that night. As she walked away, they waited uneasily. They had no way of knowing her true intentions. They hoped they hadn't just made a big mistake that would cost them everything. Finally, under the cover of darkness, a man appeared. He was carrying a gun and was accompanied by the same woman. The 2 prisoners eyed his weapon uneasily. Then the woman presented Wetzler and Verba with food and they unabashedly dug in, having hardly eaten since they left camp. They were confused when the man started laughing. He explained that judging by the way they ate, he was convinced they really were prisoners who escaped the camp and not undercover Nazis trying to test their loyalty. Wetzler and Verba followed the couple home that night. Verba had to cut his boots off as his feet had become so incredibly swollen. The man who had taken them in offered him slippers and then led the duo, including the slipper-clad Verba, right to the edge of the Slovakian border. They thanked the man for all he had done to help them, and he wished them luck and said he hoped the slippers would last for the rest of their journey. They waited until a German patrol passed before they made a run for safety. It was 2 weeks after their escape from Auschwitz before they made it to Slovakian territory. Here, a third peasant put them in contact with a well-known doctor who listened to their story and agreed to take them to the Jewish leadership of another town whom he believed would handle the matter in the best way possible. He couldn't have been more incorrect. Verba and Wetzler, who had braved 80 miles of treacherous terrain and undoubtedly risked their lives, soon found out that the message they so badly wanted to share would not be heard after all. Both men told the Jewish Council of the atrocities being committed at Auschwitz. Their goal was for the official documentation of their story that had become known as the Verba-Wetzler Report to be given to those in positions of power. In the hands of the right people, they believed the deportation and executions would be stopped. So it was sent to the Allies. Copies were given to the British, the Americans, and even the Pope. Change, however, did not come. This was for many reasons. Some copies of the report didn't make it to their intended destinations for months. There was also the problem that the head of the Hungarian Jewish underground actually failed to share the report with the right people, as he was in the process of making an agreement with the Nazis, and he believed its contents would destroy his chances. His train to freedom did end up saving 1,600 people. However, without the contents of the report being known, it also resulted in the deaths of what is suspected to be multiple hundreds of thousands. Verba and Wetzler had escaped in April of 1944. As time passed, they waited in frustration and disbelief as the weeks and months passed, and still nothing was done. It was not until June when British intelligence finally got a hold of their report. That same month, the BBC aired its contents, and days later, it made headlines in the New York Times. The world was in shock. Allied forces threatened action against those deporting Jewish Hungarians, and the Pope gave his condemnation. However, the admiral in charge of Hungary allowed deportations to continue nonetheless, having no intention of going against Hitler's wishes. It was just a coincidence that the US Air Force attacked Hungary in July, as it was not intended to specifically send the admiral a message. He took it that way though, and the trains to Auschwitz finally came to a stop. It's estimated that 300,000 Hungarian Jews had been gassed to death by this point, and just 20,000 were rescued. This was many, many more than were saved by the Freedom Train Agreement that delayed the message that Wetzler and Verba risked their lives to deliver. Together, Wetzler and Verba are credited with saving more Jews at one time than any other person during the war. However, they had to accept the haunting fact that due to the interference of others, thousands more who could have been saved were not. The total death toll was staggering, with estimates being that as many as 1.5 million people died at Auschwitz. Wetzler and Verba are heroes, but they couldn't have done what they did alone. It took the 4 men who had escaped before them and the 3 peasants who helped guide, shelter, and feed them for their ultimate success. Not to mention the British intelligence who helped finally spread the message to the rest of the world. War is cruel, and many people do cruel things. But as we've seen in this true account, when people come together despite the obstacles, there's always a chance for good that's worth fighting and even dying for. A man has just been arrested by police and is sitting in a room in the station handcuffed to a chair. Sitting in the same room are 3 detectives, so one would presume that this man could not go anywhere. One would be wrong, because this man has lip balm in his pocket, and he uses that to slip his hands out of his handcuffs. He then runs for it, and what ensues is a chase on foot that looks like something from Keystone Cops. This man we are talking about has been called one of the most brilliant escape artists in history, and now you'll see why. The man we're discussing is one Richard Lee McNair, and that escape we just mentioned was certainly not his greatest escape, not by a long way. McNair successfully escaped from the authorities 3 times, but it was his self-mailing escape and his life on the run that made him famous. Let's get back to the start though. In 1987, when McNair was a month shy of his 30th birthday, he made a very bad choice. That bad choice was to try and break into and burgle a grain storage facility in a town called Minot in North Dakota. Why he wanted to do that, we just don't know, because it wasn't as if McNair was unemployed or lacking intelligence. In fact, he had a job as a sergeant at the Minot Air Force Base that wasn't too far from the grain storage place. As McNair's brother once said, he just made some really bad decisions. That brother also said Richard was the smartest guy he ever met. Okay, so he was smart, but that didn't stop him from botching a burglary and shooting 2 men in the process. One of those men died and the other survived. McNair was quickly brought in for questioning, and he gave up a handgun at the same time. It was looking like the cops had their man, and McNair was looking at a life sentence. But as you know, things didn't go exactly as planned. and with a stick of lip balm, McNair decided to test the health and fitness of the local cops. He somehow managed to get out of the room and out of the police station. He proceeded to literally run for his life, something he'd do time and again in the future. He led the cops down a bunch of streets and then they chased him up the steps of a 3-story building. By this time, there were cops everywhere, and it was one of those "we've got this place surrounded, come out with your hands up" situations. McNair then made another bad choice. He decided not to come out with his hands up and jumped from a 3rd-floor window into a tree. The branch he landed on snapped and McNair took a nasty fall. Now that McNair was broken, the cops could make an easy arrest. After a stint in the hospital, McNair was housed at Ward County Jail in Minot. It seems that he wasn't too pleased with his new home, and he might have escaped again had the prison guards not found out that he chiseled a couple of cinder blocks loose in his cell. He was eventually sentenced to 30 years for the robbery and given 2 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. Okay, so we have 1 escape and 1 attempted escape, and now we have yet another escape. One that is not even his best escape. After a few years behind bars at the North Dakota State Penitentiary, McNair and 2 other guys managed to escape after crawling through the ventilation shafts. The 2 other guys didn't stay free for very long, but higher IQ McNair dyed his hair and did everything you should do to disguise yourself. He moved around the US for 10 months but was eventually captured. Okay, thought the authorities, it seems that some men you just can't teach, and they marked him as a problem inmate and moved him to the Minnesota Correctional Facility, Oak Park Heights. This place is the state's only level 5 maximum security prison. It houses what the authorities say are the worst of the worst. People with histories of violence or people like McNair, guys with a flair for escape. No one has ever escaped from this place, and there has only been 1 murder in the prison. That's because prisoners are pretty much locked down during their incarceration. So there was no way he was getting out of that joint. He realized that, and so after a few years he joined a sit-down protest that eventually got him moved to the high-security United States Penitentiary, Florence High. Yet again, he realized that it was unlikely that he'd escape from that place, and so he managed to get himself moved to a high-security federal prison located in Louisiana. This was the place where he would perform his pièce de résistance. You see, he got a job in this prison, and that job was to fix torn mail bags so they could be sent back to the post office to be used. All the time McNair was doing this job, he was plotting yet another escape. The date it happened was April 5, 2006. McNair was almost 50 and had spent a good portion of his adult life behind bars for making that stupid choice back in the day to rob a grain facility. That morning, McNair managed to hide inside a pallet that was full of repaired mail bags. The pallet was later shrink-wrapped, and you might wonder just how McNair managed to breathe. Well, the answer is he had created a kind of escape pod, and that included a tube that he could breathe through once he'd secretly pierced the packaging. The pallet was soon taken to a storage facility outside of the prison guards, and there, McNair waited inside his pod. When he heard the workers go for lunch, he got out of the pod and once more ran for his life. So this was lunchtime, and McNair knew very well that officers at the prison wouldn't know he was missing until about 4 p.m. He had 4 hours to run like hell toward the nearest town to get supplies and steal a car. The next part of the story is nothing short of unbelievable. So McNair is running near some railroad tracks, and a cop thinks it's a bit weird and stops him, since the cop knows an inmate is on the loose. The cop asks McNair for ID, to which he replies that he has none. He tells the cop he's just doing some exercise. But then, when he's asked what his address is, McNair says he's staying at a nearby hotel with his brother. The cop then says, "The problem is, we have an escapee on the loose." That's why McNair, who is now calling himself Robert Jones, has been stopped. The two laugh about this, and then the cop radios the station to ask if the subject wears glasses. He also asks for more information about the escapee's appearance. McNair could make a run for it any time, but he just stays there, waiting to see what the cop will do when he's on the radio. The cop explains to the other person on the line that he's looking at a man who's around 50, has bluish eyes, short hair, a goatee beard, and who wears glasses. The policeman says, "Well, you know the bad thing about it, you're matching up to him," to which McNair replies, "Well, that sucks, doesn't it?" Somehow, McNair manages to convince a cop that he's staying at some hotel whose name he can hardly remember, which is close to some construction works. "What's your name again?" the cop asks. McNair makes the mistake of now saying Jimmy Jones. The cop actually sounds apologetic for harassing the jogger and then says, "You wouldn't believe what those guys do. They got years and years to think about how they're going to do it." McNair must have thought, "Tell me about it." The next few minutes is McNair brilliantly describing the area where he's staying and again convincing the cop that he's staying at some small hotel and he's just out on his daily job. promise you, I'm not the escapee, says McNair, to which the cop replies, you'd have done run by now. And then they both have a laugh about that. Just don't get run over by a train, says the cop. Soon after, McNair is off again on his run to freedom as the cop says, be careful, buddy. He was careful too, and his journey now would shock just about every household in North America. When Christmas time rolled around, McNair did something quite brazen. He actually sent the warden of his former prison a greeting card. The authorities were not too happy about this. McNair had totally embarrassed them, and now he was rubbing pie in their faces. U.S. Marshals put McNair on their 15 most wanted list, and his story appeared on the TV series America's Most Wanted. After over a year on the run, McNair was pulled over in Canada after the police had spotted the stolen car he was driving. At the roadside while being questioned, yet again McNair made a run for it. As you can guess by now, McNair was pretty good at running. He outran the Canadian cops, and it wasn't until 2 days later that they realized that the car thief was that guy that had appeared on America's Most Wanted. The car was more closely examined and the cops found a camera. On that camera, there was lots of self-portraits of McNair. He hadn't been doing selfies out of narcissism, he'd been planning on making fake IDs. Investigators also found McNair's fingerprints in the car. The chase was on again. A few more days passed and McNair had stolen a motorbike and had already covered a lot of ground in the province of British Columbia. He then really hit the gas after stealing yet another car. To keep the authorities at bay, he crossed back into the US and drove across a few states. He then decided to drive back into Canada and drove all the way from Ontario to Vancouver. He planned to settle down in northern British Columbia at a place called Williston Lake and was about to buy some property there until he found out that there'd been a pine beetle infestation in the area. He was also concerned that there weren't enough good escape routes if the cops should ever show up. If you're wondering how he managed to get the money to buy a property and survive on the run all that time, the answer is he stole a lot of cars, and we mean a lot. You see, he had once worked as a car showroom salesman, and he knew how to steal cars from those places without getting caught. He would take brand new cars, ones without GPS, and he would try to steal white cars because they usually blended in better. He would use those cars for a while and then he'd sell them. That's how he got his cash. He appeared 12 times on America's Most Wanted, and there was even an 11-page piece written up about him in the New Yorker. He later said that he was surprised that he'd become so famous, or infamous. This was a problem for him, since just about everyone in North America who owned a TV knew what McNair looked like. But he managed to use computer technology to create driver's licenses, and he also changed his appearance a lot. He even had laptops that he used just for solely monitoring what the press was saying about him. His downfall was his own ingenuity in the end, because he was captured when a Canadian cop noticed a van that seemed to have homemade tinted windows. McNair had made those tints himself, but the cop was suspicious because the van looked really expensive. The cop took the plate number and called it in. The next day, a young Canadian policeman who'd been on the job 6 weeks spotted McNair's van. A chase ensued, and when the van was cornered yet again, McNair took off on foot. But this time, he was being chased down by a young, fit cop. McNair didn't get very far. The cop was later given an award, and in interviews he said McNair laughed and joked with him after he was captured. The game was up now, and the running man was about to face extradition to the US. McNair now resides in ADX Florence, a supermax prison where inmates are locked down 23 hours a day, and when they do leave their cell, they're surrounded by guards. This facility is one place that no man can escape from. That's why it houses international and domestic terrorists, spies, leading gang members, as well as infamous organized crime members, and the likes of one El Chapo Guzman. In fact, McNair once talked about El Chapo, and we know that because a Canadian journalist who's been writing to McNair for a long time sometimes posts what McNair says in letters on Twitter. One tweet went like this: "I've been a 10-year resident of ADX Florence, and I see a new resident is coming, El Chapo. I look forward to meeting you and sharing breakout stories." If you read that Twitter account, you'll also know why McNair always ran so well. That's because he worked out every single day when he was behind bars. The year is 2000 and the date is December 13th. 7 men at a maximum security prison in Texas are just about to perform an audacious, if not brazen, prison escape. They are dangerous men, and between them are sentenced to hundreds of years. They are not prepared to do their time. In the words of the ringleader of the gang, George Rivas, "I had no parole, I had no good time, I had no incentive to behave. The minimum amount of time I had was 270 years, and I obviously couldn't do that." He handpicked his team, and what would follow is an escape and subsequent bloody crime spree. This is the story of the Texas 7. Before we describe how these men managed to get out of maximum security prison and tell you about the horrors of what happened after they got out, let's first introduce the team. we have the ringleader, George Rivas, and you know he was never going to get out of prison. He was serving 18 consecutive 15-to-life sentences for robbery. That might seem like a lot of time for the crime, but he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and burglary. It's said he picked his team knowing he was more intelligent than them, but also because he knew they were dangerous men. Then we have Joseph Garcia, who was serving life for killing a man in a drunken altercation. Randy Halprin was doing time for badly beating a baby. He got 30 years. Larry Harper was serving 50 years for rape and acts of voyeurism. Patrick Murphy had 50 years to serve for aggravated assault, a particularly nasty crime against a woman. Donald Newbury was in for aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon, and Michael Rodriguez was serving 99 years to life for hiring a man to kill his wife. These are the Texas 7. Rivas picked the team, and at some point the men began meeting at the John B. Connolly unit at the prison. Getting out of such a place was not going to be easy, and some believe the men hatched their plan over perhaps an entire year. On the day of the escape, just before lunch, the guards at the maintenance area sent the prisoners off for their chow. The guards then went for their lunch. Only Rivas, Garcia, Halprin, Harper, and Newbury were left in the maintenance area because they had managed to convince the maintenance supervisor that they had to wax the floors there. They told him that they would take lunch in this area. The supervisor said, fair enough, but he'd have to stay behind with them. Murphy, working in another area, asked to join the crew, and he was given the green light. As for the last of the group, Rodriguez, he managed to join the crew after lying to the guards that he had been told he had to pick up trash there. He wasn't initially part of the escape plan, but he became so. The men were all joined together just as they had planned. Then they had told the supervisor to follow them to a warehouse where they needed something. There, they got him down on the ground, stole his clothes, and left him tied up in a small electrical room. The crew found more clothes, but more importantly, they got the keys to the room where the tools were stored. In that room, they managed to get their hands on 2 hacksaws, a bolt cutter, wire cutting pliers, and a utility knife. Over the next 2 hours, they would get more clothes and the things they needed after subduing 2 prison guards as well as other inmates. Some of those hostages would get out of their restraints, but the gang would make sure they couldn't get out of the room that they'd been tied up in. With the clothes they'd stolen, the gang could now pretend to be supervisors, and that they did. They could also make sure the head count was right, although they were of course missing. Around this time, things could have gone wrong because one of the hostages in the room set the fire alarm off, but it was taken as a false alarm. The men in disguise then approached the gate where heavily armed guards were. They told the guards that they had a job to do, and that was to install video cameras. The guards let them through the gate and importantly did not ask for any ID. They came upon another guard at a gatehouse, and this one did ask for ID, but then the gang had been clever because they had left one guy in the maintenance department. That guy actually called the gatehouse to ask him if the men had turned up to install the video cameras. After this, the men subdued this guard and tied him up. Meanwhile, Halprin gained access to one of the towers, where an armed guard was stationed. Halprin later said in interviews that this guard had a lot of weapons on him, so he quickly lunged to grab one of his guns and pointed it at him. He then ordered the guard to open the vehicle gate. After that, he gained entrance to the armory, where he would take a lot of weapons from there. The stash of weapons included a 12-gauge Remington pump-action shotgun and 14 rounds of ammunition, 14 .357 Magnum Smith & Wesson revolvers with a total of 210 rounds, and a .223 caliber AR-15 assault rifle with 15 rounds. Now, these guys were certainly very dangerous. The entire gang left the prison with all these weapons in a stolen truck. After they were well out of sight of the prison, one of the tied-up guards got loose and reported the escape. So now we have 7 criminals with histories of violence let loose in Texas, and worse, they're armed to the teeth. The authorities put word out that very dangerous criminals were driving around and they were heavily armed. The manhunt was on, but nothing was going to be easy for the authorities. At the same time, the guards found 3 letters left by the gang, with some of those letters decrying the harsh conditions inside. One of the letters said, "You haven't heard the last of us yet." The authorities would take this as a threat, although the writer of that letter would later say that this was not the case at all. The men now have weapons, but they don't have much money. They do what they know best, and that's steal cash. At a Radio Shack store, they first take a look around, but then go back just before closing time. There are still some customers in there and 4 employees in total, all of whom are subdued. What's strange is the hostages said the gang were very friendly. Later in interviews, this gang said throughout the entire ordeal they tried their best not to hurt anyone, But as you'll see, that certainly did not happen. We should also state that during the hostage-taking in the prison, people were held at knife point and also hit over the head or punched in the face. They stole thousands of dollars from the store, as well as electrical equipment, which included walkie-talkies and police scanners. The team then headed to Dallas, knowing full well that the police would think they were headed to the Mexican border. The group now had money, but they wanted more. On Christmas Eve, they decided to rob an Oshman Sporting Goods in Irving, Dallas County. They got to the store, bound and gagged the staff, and it said stole thousands of dollars as well as more than 40 different guns and lots of ammunition. But while this was going on, an employee was outside the store and he noticed something strange. He called the cops and 29-year-old police officer Aubrey Wright Hawkins turned up. Almost immediately, he came under fire. The officer was shot at different angles by perhaps 3 of the crew. Because they were firing from different sides of the car, at least one of the crew was hit. The officer was shot 11 times, with many of the bullets entering his head. He was then run over 3 times and left for dead. He actually died later in the hospital. The officer was married and had a son, and he was expected to celebrate Christmas with his family the next day. Later in an interview, his mother would say that his son said all he wanted for Christmas was his father back. The gang then fled in their motorhome, which was now packed with cash and guns. They'd even made a gun rack for their many weapons. They later parked this at a Christian community and posed as missionaries, saying they were doing the work of God. This was all a lie, except one of the men, Larry Harper, did attend Bible class and seemed to get into it. In interviews, the other people living on this kind of commune said the men seemed pretty normal, and Larry was welcome to the classes. But as time went by, the men couldn't hide. It was Rivas that was first spotted because someone noticed his face and the fact that he had a twitch. The police were called, but at first thought it just couldn't be the gang because there was no way they would have been stupid enough to stick together. Police soon knew they had their men and believed there could be one huge gunfight, but that didn't happen. First, Garcia, Rodriguez, and Rivas were arrested while driving around in a Jeep. After that, police went back to the park to get the other men, and there they found Halpern and Harper. The former gave himself up, but Harper put a gun to his head and killed himself. He left the Bible open next to him on a page about forgiveness. He also left a letter apologizing to his family and the Bible group he had deceived. The remaining 2 men, Newbury and Murphy, hid out through most of January and then told authorities that they'd hand themselves in if they could make a TV appearance. The authorities agreed, and the 2 men went on TV and denounced the criminal justice system. They said the system is as corrupt as we are. Newbury told the camera, "The way I see it is I had to make a statement. Our judicial system in the state of Texas has really gone to pits. We're receiving 99 years for a robbery for $68. Nobody injured." He said he'd been set up, that the evidence was flimsy at best, and he got 99 years. He added, "I've done the crime. You've got to face the music, but there's got to be something within reason in the state of Texas. They're giving kids so much time that they'll never get to see light again. Their life is gone. Now all they are is a roach in a cage." These words wouldn't save him. The authorities and the public had seen how these men killed a young father on Christmas Eve. People were furious. The men were sentenced to death. In 2008, Rodriguez was the first to go, having said he didn't want to appeal further. 2012, the ringleader Rivas was the next to go. Before he was executed, he said this to the family of the slain police officer: "I do apologize for everything that happened. Not because I'm here, but for closure in your hearts. I'm ready to go." Newbury was executed in 2015 and Garcia was executed in 2018. Halpern and Murphy are still in prison, with Murphy being the only one of the 2 who has an execution date. He's scheduled to die by lethal injection in November, so by the time you watch this show, that might already have happened. The case of Halpern has caused much controversy. He's been scheduled to be executed, but then his trial judge was accused of racial discrimination. Halpern is Jewish, and the judge was said to have used racial slurs against him and also said Jews need to be shut down because they control all the money. The Washington Post wrote that after that, Halpern's attorneys demanded a new trial. It got worse for the judge, according to the Post, because other people called him a lifelong racist who had vented anger on many occasions against lots of minorities in the USA. The newspaper wrote that this judge had even set up a trust fund for his kids that they would get on the condition of them marrying a straight, white Christian person, spurring a lot of the American public to ask how this man became a judge. With this in mind, asked Halpern's attorneys, how could any non-Christian, non-white person receive a fair trial? And that's where the story of the Texas 7 ends. For now. This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics2019 to try out one of their premium plans right now. Some of you might have heard about a little island that lies just 1¼ miles off San Francisco. The only reason you've likely heard the name is because arguably the United States' most infamous prison was located there. The prison closed down, but tales keep being told. That prison had been home to some of America's most notorious criminals, and not for a second did the authorities think any of them could ever escape. That's because even if a prisoner did make it to the edge of the island, it was thought there was no way anyone could make it to land through the frigid and choppy water. The FBI believes that the only people that did ever get to the water died there. Full stop. Game over. It was impossible. But that might not be the case. Before we tell you about the recent revelations that might have proved the FBI were wrong all along, and indeed some men made it through the water and onto land, we think we should tell you about the escape itself. It's worthy of a movie, and that's why myriad movies have been made partly based on this brazen escape. The year is 1962. There have been 12 escape attempts before this year, and all of them failed. Not only did prisoners with escape in mind have to break out of their cells, but they had to scale high walls and get past armed guards. And then there was the dangerous waters of the San Francisco Bay. And as we said, the last hurdle was thought to be insurmountable. But 4 men this year weren't the type of guys to shy away from a challenge. Their names were Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, Alan West, and Frank Morris. And on June 11th, they made perhaps the most daring prison escape attempt ever. You'd be right in thinking that 2 of these men were related. They were actually brothers, and like the other 2 men, they were career criminals. We won't go into their backgrounds much, but it's important we give you a few details, as this might give you a clue as to how these men might have survived. For instance, the 2 Anglin brothers were said to be inseparable as kids, and from a young age, as early as 14, they were both toughing it out as laborers. After that, the duo decided that robbing banks was easier and less strain on the back, and the criminal career started. But the important thing we should mention is that both these guys, when just little kids, were said to enjoy swimming in Lake Michigan during the winter. It's said they impressed people around them by their incredible swimming ability, but also the fact that they could swim when there was still ice in the water. Another thing we should mention was the fact that Frank Morris was said to have a very high IQ. We aren't saying he was a genius, but an IQ of 133 isn't bad at all. So we have strength and we have brains, and it just so happened in 1961, these guys were placed in cells adjacent to each other. Now we see the plot thicken. It was Morris who was the brains of the operation, and he enlisted the 2 brothers who no doubt told him that surviving in the water would be a cinch. They did not wing their escape, however, and over 6 months devised and orchestrated their plan. What they knew they needed to do was widen the ventilation ducts in their respective cells. These ducts were too small for them to crawl into, and so with sharpened spoons and stolen saw blades, as well as a drill they had fashioned from a vacuum cleaner, they got to work. That was a noisy business, making the hole bigger, but the guards didn't hear a thing, as Morris spent most of the night playing his accordion. The guards weren't suspicious because they'd heard this sound before. The thing was, as the holes widened, it looked like a mess in the wall. So what the guys did was paint a piece of cardboard the exact same color as the wall and stick it over the hole in the daytime when they weren't working. You see, what these men knew is that when they got through the hole, they would hit a utility tunnel, a place far away from any guards. After a while, they could easily get into this tunnel, but that didn't mean they could just escape. Even though 2 of them were great swimmers, they knew swimming that distance at night would be hard or impossible, so they devised to make a raft. This took a few months, and the raft was made out of at least 50 raincoats that the men had stolen or other prisoners had given them. They also made paddles out of wood and bolts, and had life jackets. Those life jackets were also made out of raincoats, with the men using a process called vulcanization, a process to heat rubber to make the seams stick so that they could be blown up. It was the same for the raft. The men could make sure no air got out, and they could in time inflate it. But what we like the most is what the guys did to evade suspicion when they were in the tunnel working on the raft. They of course couldn't just go missing from their cells, so they made dummies. We've seen pictures of the heads, and they are unbelievably lifelike considering what they had to work with. The heads were made from cement, skin-colored paint, and the best bit, human hair they'd collected from the prison barbers. It makes you wonder just how creative and industrious these men could have been had they not chosen a life of crime. It took about 6 months to get the raft finished. Now we have the problem of actually getting to the water. This got off to a bad start for West because he'd used a kind of cement to keep his grill in place. What he hadn't reckoned on was the strength of this cement, and he couldn't even get his grill off on June 11th. He was left behind, and his confession is why we know knows so much about the escape. The other 3 men got into the tunnel, collected the raft and the rest of what they needed, and then they made their way to the roof. We're told from there they scaled down a kitchen vent pipe which was around 50 feet high. They then climbed 2 fences which were covered with barbed wire and were 12 feet high. It seems that they just used their strength, and 12 feet isn't too hard to climb. Now they were in a blind spot from the guards, and this is where they could inflate the raft. That's a lot of blowing for a pair of human lungs, but the guys had the concertina from Morse's accordion. That's the thing you push and pull that acts a bit like a human lung. The guards only realized the next day that the men were missing, and so the escapees had plenty of time to make it to land. The question is, did they make it? An investigation led to a paddle being found, but also bits of raincoat being discovered on the nearby Angel Island beach. Did this mean they got there, or just mean it had floated there? The FBI said that night the currents were really strong, and after many years of trying to find the men, they closed the investigation in 1979. The men had died. That was it. The end. But over the years, siblings of the 2 brothers would come forward and say they'd been contacted by their brothers. Countless other people would lead police on a wild goose chase, saying they were the escapees, or they'd been contacted by the men. It's said at one point the Anglin brothers might have attended a funeral of one of their older brothers, and there have even been sightings in Brazil. It's been called one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American crime, and to this day, U.S. Marshals say they still get leads as to where these guys are. But the fact is, there hasn't really been any substantial proof that the guys made it. Well, not until a recent bombshell hit the media. That's because in January 2013, the FBI received a letter they didn't tell the media about for a while. They decided to repress it, but they reopened the case. This is how the letter started. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. The problem was that any DNA analysis was inconclusive, but still, something just rang true about the letter. The writer states that the brains of the group Morris died back in 2008. The writer was obviously one of the surviving brothers. This is what he told the police. If you announce on TV that I'll be promised to first go to jail for no more than a year and to get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am. This is no joke. If the brothers did survive, now they would be in their late 80s. Morris would be 91, but he might have died if that letter is real. One thing to note though is that one FBI investigator who'd been with the agency for over 20 years told the media when the letter was released that just saying the raft failed and it was impossible to swim wasn't exactly conclusive. We know these men could swim well, and these days we know many athletes can swim through that water and spend a long time in it. It's hardly an inhuman task to swim the San Francisco Bay. Then there's the fact that investigators say, well, we would have found them, they'd have committed other offenses. That's hardly convincing too. The writer of the letter added that he had lived around the USA after the escape, and if the letter is real, it seems he did become a law-abiding citizen. That, or he just never got caught committing a crime. There's other stuff too, such as what the nephew of the brothers said many years later. My grandmother received roses for several years after the escape, he said to the media. That nephew added that the authorities should allow the writer of the letter to come in and let him be treated, but it seems the authorities had no interest in doing that. Well, the statement was released, so it seems there is some interest. The U.S. Marshal Service has not completely given up. It has publicly stated it will continue to pursue the escapees until they are either arrested, positively determined to be deceased, or reach the age of 99. This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head on over to wix.com/go/infographics2019 to try out one of their premium plans right now. Guantanamo Bay Naval Station is located on southeastern Cuba, a small 45-square-mile American military station on lease from Cuba since 1903. In the past, it's been an important naval station, ensuring U.S. military forces remain close to the Caribbean and its many vitally important trade routes. However, in 2002, the U.S. began construction of a detention camp where it would house suspected terrorists that it ensnared in its global war on terror. But just how secure is this facility? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're asking, is it possible to escape from Guantanamo Bay? The Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, or GITMO as it's commonly known, is a prison facility located on the U.S.'s Guantanamo Bay Naval Station. At the start of the U.S.'s war on terror, a need for a secure housing facility for dangerous suspected terrorists and insurgents was immediately identified by the U.S. government, and thus construction began on what would be known as Camp X-Ray, which would later be shut down as Camp Delta. A 612-unit detention center came online. Camp Delta now houses Camps 1 through 6, as well as Camp Echo, where detainees are in-processed upon arrival. For 3 years, the CIA also operated a small site known as Penny Lane, which housed special prisoners the agency tried to recruit as spies. While the rest of the facility featured pretty sparse living quarters, Penny Lane had private kitchens, showers, televisions, and beds with mattresses, all in a bid to encourage prisoners to cooperate. Nearly from the start of operations, allegations of abuse and torture leaked to the press. Condemned by the United Nations, the U.S. argued that detainees at Gitmo were not guaranteed Geneva Convention rights and protections because they had specifically chosen not to fight as regular soldiers or operate under a clear chain of command. Terrorists and guerrilla fighters, the U.S. argued, were not protected by Geneva Conventions in place to protect uniformed prisoners of war. Men whose nations chose to abide by international law should be the only ones protected by that law. If allegations of torture weren't enough, however, soon it was revealed to the public that most of the detainees couldn't be verified to have any actual links to terror organizations, and instead had simply been combatants arrested by NATO troops. Others had their links to terror networks greatly exaggerated, though a few were indeed some of the most dangerous men in the world. Because Guantanamo hosts some of the world's most dangerous terrorists, specific information about its security features are almost impossible to ascertain. However, we asked a security expert with 6 years' experience securing priority level 1 resources for the US government how a prisoner may in fact escape. Our expert, which asked to remain anonymous, said that escape was likely impossible, but every security has key vulnerabilities that can be defeated. The trick is being able to defeat all of a security system's vulnerabilities one after the other in the limited amount of time you have for an escape attempt, something which is simply not likely. First off, you're going to have to deal with the security personnel themselves. What is known about internal security at Gitmo is that military police personnel conduct constant rounds, making visual inspections of their prisoners every 3 minutes through a window on the cell door. Then there's the locking mechanism on the door itself, which is typically behind a ½ inch of steel and impossible to access. Simply put, you're not going to get out of your cell unless a guard lets you out, so your best chance for escape is to get friendly with a guard. If you're a particularly handsome man, trying to woo one of the female guards, approximately 20% of Guantanamo Bay's prison staff is female, you're going to be hard-pressed to get through all the anti-terrorist indoctrination. But hey, stranger things have happened. If that's not possible though, and you somehow manage to compromise the locking mechanism on your door, our source wouldn't comment on how to do this, then you're gonna have to deal with that pesky, constantly patrolling guard, checking in on you every 3 minutes. Luckily for you though, our source states that the greatest vulnerability of any security system is always the human element. Guards become complacent, and while at the start of a shift, those 3-minute checks may come so punctually you could set your watch by them, but as the hours creep by, especially at night, 3-minute checks are going to turn into 4-minute checks, then 5 or 6-minute checks. Eventually, they may become even just hourly. Bigger security lapses have happened at facilities more sensitive than Gitmo. Complacency and time is your friend. Once you've figured out how to get out of your cell, simply wait. Be a model inmate, don't rile up the guards and lull them into a false sense of complacency. Wait for a popular holiday such as Thanksgiving or Christmas when guards will have more on their minds than just simply making some boring, repetitive rounds that they've made for months on end. That's when you make your escape. There are, however, bound to be additional security features inside the prison facility's housing units than just the door on the cell, and it's unlikely that you'll be able to defeat these without raising the alarm. One source tells us that because of its small size, Gitmo enjoys the benefits of smaller prison centers, better engineering and construction, which eliminates many of the pitfalls of larger complexes, such as the large access shafts that pierce through the heart of Alcatraz. Plus, the small size of the prison complex lets the guards enjoy a much better guard-to-prisoner ratio, which means more eyes on you than in a place with a larger population. Assuming you make it outside, however, you are almost certainly going to have to deal with several layers of security fencing. In most government facilities, video cameras ring the entire perimeter and are set up so each camera covers another's blind spot. A central alarm monitoring center will typically have 1 or 2 operators responsible for monitoring all interior and exterior alarms, and be able to instantly bring up any alarmed sector of the fence line on camera for a visual inspection. A persistent alarm, or if the camera is mysteriously down for some reason, will prompt them to send an armored patrol to make a physical sweep of the area. So how can you defeat multiple layers of alarmed fence line? Well, much the same way as you defeat the interior security. Prey on human fallibility. Most secure facilities have 3 different types of sensors along their fences. The first is a Raycon microwave sensor that detects movement between the fence lines. The second is a tout wire sensor, which runs the length of the fence line and detects climbing or cutting. and the third is buried in the ground and designed to detect vibrations. That's 3 security features to overcome in the span of just a few minutes. How could you do it? Though the physical security system itself is formidable, it will always have one significant weakness: the human operators. Most security personnel will spend their entire career with 99.99% of every alarm and incident being a false alarm. This breeds a deep sense of complacency when training and professionalism dips amongst a security force. Some of the worst offenders, though, can be alarm operators themselves, whom typically spend countless hours pulling up alarms along the perimeter, which end up being nothing more than just a rabbit or mouse scurrying about. Add to that inclement weather, with winds pushing along debris and blowing on the fence line, and an alarm operator's board can light up like a Christmas tree, inevitably leading them to ignoring the majority of alarm calls for the duration of the storm, or simply accessing them and telling security personnel to conduct regular patrols through the area. Your task, therefore, is going to be to encourage an alarm operator to ignore the alarms you'll soon be setting off. This can be easily achieved, but will require greater patience, and will require the help of someone on the outside. Your secret collaborator will report to the planned escape route 2 weeks before your big escape, and camp out all night long outside the piece of fence line you'll be penetrating, while making sure they stay hidden from any security patrols. For 2 entire weeks, your compatriot will be tasked with setting off at least 2 of the 3 alarm systems on that piece of fence line, over and over again for hours on end every single night. This can be achieved relatively easily. You can do things like attach a thin fishing line to a piece of debris, such as a small stick, and hurl it over the fences to the other side. Then tug against the fences or drag it along the ground. This will set off the alarms, but when an alarm operator pulls up the video feed, they'll only see a piece of random debris. Alternatively, you can also use the same tactic used by American infiltrators during the Cold War against the Soviet secure facilities. Purchase a large amount of mice or other rodents, and every night release several into the fence line one at a time over the course of hours. Seeing nothing but animals in the cameras after several days of this alarm, the operator will be inclined to simply begin ignoring new alarms from that sector. Repeat the procedure enough times, and chances are that the alarm operator will get sick of hearing the same alarm dozens of times night after night, and simply access it, silencing it, and ignoring it. Complacency is your greatest ally. Escaping from Guantanamo Bay is likely impossible, though, due to the physical security located inside the prison itself. Though ironically, the secure fencing is certainly the weakest element to overcome. Yet, even if you manage to make it to the outside of the prison, you'll still be amidst a U.S. naval station, and any escape will have to take into consideration the U.S. Navy's sea and air resources, to include patrol craft and helicopters. Escaping from Guantanamo Bay may not be possible after all. The year was 1953, and British criminal Alfred George Hines was serving 12 years in prison. But the Nottingham prison where he was held wouldn't be able to contain him, as he eventually got through locked doors and climbed a 20-foot wall to freedom. He spent almost a year across Europe before being recaptured, and then quickly escaped while awaiting trial and headed straight for the airport. He was caught again, but escaped from Chelmsford prison and fled to Ireland, where his freedom lasted 2 years. He became notorious in the British media, dubbed Houdini Hines, and was inducted into Mensa after his eventual release from prison. Many people consider him the greatest prison escape artist of all time. This video is not about people like him. There are around 2,000 prison escapes each year in the United States, but that number is dwarfed by the number of escape attempts. Most of these are foiled very quickly, and most never even get off the grounds of the prison. Common tactics for escaping prison include trying to scale the prison walls, running into the nearby woods, or attempting to get smuggled out of the prison. Guards know how to look out for these tactics by now, and uncreative inmates usually find themselves right back where they started, maybe with a longer sentence or less comfortable quarters. Other inmates are taking a more aggressive approach and starting riots or taking guards hostage. Those usually end in a standoff and hostage negotiation that's highly unlikely to end with release. But some inmates take more creative approaches to escape. We said creative, not effective. Kenneth Burnham was doing a few years in prison for burglary when he started to get stir-crazy. He watched other inmates in his Hamilton County, Tennessee prison get prepped for release and thought, why not me? Then he took that a bit too literally. As another inmate was about to be released on bond awaiting trial, Burnham took advantage of the light security and decided he'd simply take that man's identity. He presented himself when the officers came to collect the lucky inmate and signed all the paperwork. He was just minutes away from freedom. There was just one problem. The inmate set for release, Glenn Taylor, was black, and Burnham was definitely not black. Prison officials looked on the sheet and saw the issue, and Burnham's not-so-great escape was stopped in its tracks. Burnham briefly claimed to have not been aware Taylor was black, but admitted he just wanted to escape. He wound up being charged with criminal impersonation and attempted escape, ensuring he'd have a bit longer to cook up half-baked escape attempts. At least he stayed clean, unlike our next inept inmate. Everyone remembers the famous prison escape from the Shawshank Redemption, as innocent lifer Andy Dufresne tirelessly tunneled his way out of his cell and escaped through the prison's sewer system. But fact isn't as glamorous as fiction, as one Brazilian inmate found out. He tunneled out of his cell into the sewer system too, but he wasn't all that well prepared. He decided to make his escape wearing only a pair of shorts. Not ideal wear for digging around through human waste to make your escape. At least the sewer's a clear shot to freedom, right? Wrong. From the moment the unfortunate prisoner decided to make his escape, it was nothing but one humiliation after another. He got stuck in the sewer only a few feet from his cell, lost his shorts in the sewer, and had to be pulled to safety covered in filth and completely naked by two other men. The man's ill-advised escape attempt was caught on video that went viral around the world, but his name was never released to the public and no one knows what became of him. He's probably happy about that. It's hard to keep cool in prison, but one inmate took impatience to another level. Andrew Wilson seemed to be a model prisoner, doing time for burglary, theft, and possession of controlled substances. He had to keep his nose clean in prison and was approaching his parole board hearing. All he had to do was stay calm and do his work detail. Wilson wasn't considered a high-risk inmate, so he was given a little more freedom, which one day he decided to take full advantage of. He stole a truck at the work camp he was serving at, drove off, and ditched the truck to run to freedom in the next town. He tried to stay ahead of the authorities, but it wasn't long before he was caught with drugs on his person. He was facing new charges of possession and escape from custody and would be extending his stay in Tennessee's Corrections Department. But he did get one piece of good news when he was back in custody. The parole department had approved his release only 24 hours after he escaped. Patience is a virtue, but not for Andrew Wilson. Making an escape from prison is hard enough. Staying free is even harder. One inmate found that out the hard way. The Olympic Correction Center in Washington was a relatively easy prison to escape from, and James Russell was no rookie. He was serving his fourth prison term and had just been transferred to the minimum security work camp. It didn't take long for the serial thief to take full advantage, as he made a break for it and escaped into the nearby woods. But he was in a rural area, still wearing his prison gear, and needed some help to make his escape complete. He came across a cabin at a nearby river resort and decided to sneak in. Sounds like a smart plan, not like anyone would recognize him. There was just one problem. The current resident of the cabin was a guard at that exact prison that Russell had escaped from. Seeing an escaped inmate, the guard immediately tackled Russell. Russell escaped, but the guard notified all the other guards in the area to be on the lookout. Russell was quickly tracked down by the other guards, facing new charges for escape. The serial offender's brief stay in minimum security was over. Most prison escapees are hardened criminals, right? Not quite. Christopher Boscacci had only arrived at Elmwood Correctional Facility a few days earlier, but he was quickly getting tired of prison life. It was time to get out of there, and he made a break for it. Boscacci was actually much better at escape than most inmates, and the guards were taken by surprise at just how fast he made it over the fences. But he wasn't prepared for just how many fences there were, and after leaving his shoe atop the barbed wire, he was eventually snagged before scaling the last fence. What terrible fate was Boscacci fleeing? The hardened criminal doing hard time was actually facing misdemeanor petty theft charges, and he was staying in a minimum security facility while awaiting arraignment. By making a break for it, he traded his relatively comfortable digs for a stay in maximum security and felony charges that would likely see him staying in the prison system for several years instead of a short stay in county jail or probation. Most prisoners who fail at their escapes just head right back to where they left, but some aren't so lucky. Prison escapes have been going on far longer than the modern prison system, and old-time prisons could be very tricky to escape. What they lacked in modern security they made up for in treacherous designs that threatened any escapee with certain death. That didn't stop Griffith ap Llywelyn, a Welsh king, in 1244. He had been held in prison for much of his life due to conflicts over his father's land, and he was eventually held in the notorious Tower of London by his brother Dafydd in a particularly nasty family feud. He had enough, and he hatched a dangerous plot. He designed himself an improvised rope made from his bed sheets and threw them out the window, planning to scale the Tower of London and rappel down. There was only one problem. All those years in captivity weren't great for exercise, and Griffith's weight was too much for the thin cloth to handle. He did make it down from the Tower of London, but at a much faster speed than he was hoping. Griffith wasn't the only famous prisoner to try and fail to escape, and the next one shows that higher education is no guarantee of strategic smarts. Dr. Samuel Mudd might have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, treating the injured John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But his participation in lying to authorities got him a life sentence in prison. He was imprisoned on the isolated Fort Jefferson, and prisoners had a bit more freedom there since they couldn't get off the grounds easily. Mudd befriended Henry Kelly, a teenager working on the transport steamer, and convinced the boy to smuggle him off the island. Mudd changed into professional-looking clothes, snuck into Kelly's ship, and tried to blend in. There was just one problem. He was probably the most famous convict in the country at the moment. He was soon identified by the fort's storekeeper, arrested, and sentenced to hard labor. Kelly also found himself in trouble for participating in the escape plot. But Mudd's story had a happier ending than most failed prison escapees. He was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson and headed home after only a few years. Getting help is a good way to get out of prison, but the partner in crime doesn't always work out. Michael Coleman and Lester Burns were tired of their stay in prison, and when the opportunity presented itself, they made their escape. They were on a long trip in a prison van along with other inmates when they had to make an emergency stop due to a prisoner's medical issue. When the guards were in the hospital with the sick inmate, the inmates were left in the van, and 5 of them watched in shock as Coleman and Burns jumped back into the van and drove it off. There was just one problem. Oklahoma inmate Joshua Silverman wanted no part of this, and when Coleman and Burns stopped the van briefly, he called 911 and let the authorities know exactly where they were. He knew the penalty for an escape attempt and wanted to play it safe, and soon the authorities were all over the area tracking down the inmates one by one. Coleman and Burns were foiled because not everyone they drafted into their escape was on board. Some inmates go further than most to escape, and this next one even got his family involved. Clavino da Silva was a notorious drug trafficker in Brazil, and he was serving a sentence of more than 70 years when he hatched his escape plan. One of the few people who still visited him on the inside was his 19-year-old daughter, and when she arrived, he convinced her to help him. When the daughter left the prison after her visit, everyone noticed she looked a little different, and it didn't take long for the ruse to unravel. It was Clavino da Silva dressed up as his own daughter, and he was less than convincing. A tight pink t-shirt and a rubber mask that made him look like a cartoon character weren't fooling anyone. Making it worse, he had left his daughter behind to serve his sentence. He wound up back in prison, and his daughter found herself facing criminal charges for abetting an escape. One of Brazil's great criminal masterminds found his skills deserting him when it came to getting out of prison. Sometimes all it takes is one error to make a great prison escape fall apart, as our last inmate found out. There was no escaping from the most notorious prison in American history, Alcatraz Island. It had one unique security feature, the raging waters off the coast, which made swimming to shore all but impossible. But that didn't stop inmates from trying, and all 14 escape attempts were foiled, except for 5 men who were never found. Only one man ever got to shore from Alcatraz Island. His name was John Paul Scott, and he would have been a legend if it wasn't for one major misstep. A bank robber doing 30 years, he was sent to Alcatraz in 1949 and served 13 years before making his move. He snuck out using a rope while on culinary duty and left his injured partner in crime behind. He swam all the way to Little Alcatraz, a nearby rock formation, making him the only person to survive the waters without being captured. There was only one problem. He was completely exhausted and collapsed on the rock where he was picked up soon after. Was it possible to escape from Alcatraz? Not for long. This video is made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics2019 to try out one of their premium plans right now. "We go tonight" is often the dramatic movie line you hear in the prison escape epic. But in the case of escapes, fiction doesn't need to embellish hard facts. It's some endeavor for the prisoner to break out of a cell, go over a wall, dig tunnels under the ground, sometimes tie up a guard, and for the criminal with some cash behind him, perhaps get a helicopter out of there. We've already told you about possibly the only escape from the notorious prison of Alcatraz, of El Chapo's escape tunnel, and we've gone over some pretty terrible failed escapes. But what we have for you today, we can say, are some of the most ingenious prison escapes on record. Number 9. Explosive fruit. In 1996, the New York Times reported that a man who had been serving an 18-year sentence in France for armed robbery managed to escape from prison. This was a 34-year-old called Michel Vougeot who had previously escaped from prison in France 3 times. This escape was said to be his most brazen, worthy of a trophy if they were awarded for such criminal activity. It was reported that Vosjou flew away in a helicopter with a woman who it was later said was his wife and who had been taking flying lessons in preparation for the escape. What the Times didn't say was that to get to the roof, Vosjou had an ingenious way of getting past guards. He was holding grenades and threatening to throw them at anyone who got in his way, except those grenades, according to CNN, were nectarines that he had earlier painted to look like grenades. CNN said that he was later captured, but then says he ended up doing another bank robbery only to be shot in the head and survive. We're not sure where he is right now, but it seems he's written a book and is a free man. Number 8. More food stuff. Prior to this 2015 escape, no one had ever escaped from the maximum security Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. At around 5 a.m., guards discovered that 2 men were missing from their cells, and they were the convicted murderers Richard Matt and David Sweat. It was soon found out that these men had painstakingly made a tunnel whose ending, called an external breach, was 500 feet outside the prison walls. This would of course take some doing with a spoon, but it said the men managed to get a hold of tools from contractors inside the prison. Those tunnels were partially already made, but still a lot of digging, breaking, and cutting had to be done. The New York Times said that the men first had to cut through the cell, and for that they used a hacksaw. A prison tailor later admitted he'd been smuggling in blades hidden inside frozen hamburger meat. The escape had been compared to the one in the movie The Shawshank Redemption, but it ended badly after a massive manhunt resulted in Matt being shot and killed by U.S. Border Patrol and Sweat being shot and then sent back to prison. Number 7. Tight fit. This is the story of a man nicknamed the Korean Houdini, and we very much doubt anyone will ever repeat what he did to get out of prison. That's because he didn't require any fancy tools, helicopters, or weapons. He just needed to lose a bit of weight and become more flexible. On the day of his escape in 2012, he covered himself in a kind of gel and then proceeded to squeeze his body through a 15-centimeter high, 45-centimeter wide food slot. Take a moment, please, to imagine what that might have looked like. The police at the detention center in Daegu Police Station in Korea were rightly stumped. It was only when they looked at surveillance footage that they saw the 165-centimeter, 114-pound man slipping through the small hole that they knew how he had gotten away. The man was said to be very flexible because during the 23 years he'd been incarcerated during his life, he had been practicing yoga and had become a master. He was recaptured anyway a few weeks later. The Korean authorities later told the press that they had now given him a cell with a smaller food slot. Number 6. The Studious Serial Killer. There's no doubt you've all heard of Ted Bundy, perhaps one of the most demented and violent serial killers in American history. What you might not know is that he escaped from cells twice during his incarceration in the 1970s. The first time was perhaps the most ingenious, with Bundy telling authorities he needed to study law as he was representing himself. He'd already studied law as a free man, but during a court trial he said he needed to read up on something. He was given access to the library during recess, and as he wasn't wearing restraints because he was both lawyer and prisoner, he went to that library unimpeded. He then jumped out of a second-story window and went on the run. He was recaptured, but then when imprisoned at a later date, he used books again to escape. This time he simply got through the jailhouse roof and then left books under his blanket so guards would think it was him sleeping. According to Bundy, one of the most educated serial killers we've seen, escaping was easy. This is what he said to a prison psychologist on the telephone. Over the months, I had noticed a number of opportunities to just walk right out. I'd thought a great deal about escape, and I didn't know if I had the guts to do it, quite frankly. Number 5. A simple plan. This next one might sound simple, but it took guts, and you could say there was genius in the simplicity. The escapee was called Charles Victor Thompson, and he'd been sentenced to death for murdering his girlfriend in 1998. During his time behind bars, he conceived of a simple plan, and that was to walk right out of prison. For this, he first had to smuggle in ordinary clothes. And in 2005, he arranged a meeting with his lawyer. Apparently, at one point, the lawyer left the room, and then Thompson got into his civilian clothes. He opened the door and started walking, and then after that, he said he just later walked anywhere he could find open doors until he found himself next to a door that led to freedom. He didn't last long on the outside, however, and while he was sheltered and fed because he was pretending to be a Hurricane Katrina evacuee, the cops got him after he made a drunken phone call. He's now back in prison and has written a couple of books. Oh, and to this day, no one knows where he got the handcuff key from, and Thompson doesn't want to tell. Number 4. The Escape Artist. Here we have a notorious British criminal with quite a brain, and that's because not only did he break out of prisons 3 times, but he learned law while inside and represented himself. His name was Alfie Hines, and he was to serve a 12-year stint for armed robbery in the 1950s. During one of those escapes, he'd gotten fellow inmates to do some work on a toilet door, and that meant attaching metal screw eyes to the door. When Hines asked to go to the toilet, he was escorted by 2 officers, but then Hines pushed the officers into a toilet and attached a padlock he'd earlier smuggled into the screw eyes. His freedom lasted all but 5 hours. Nonetheless, after escaping another 2 times, he was eventually given a pardon for his crimes because of his vast knowledge of the British legal system. After that, he acquired celebrity status in the UK. Number 3. A sticky situation. The BBC reported in 2017 that a whole bunch of inmates had escaped from an Alabama prison after tricking a guard with peanut butter. The article tells us that the inmates were well aware that one of the guards was new and perhaps didn't know his way around very well. It said the prisoners used peanut butter to cover up a number on an exit door. In a statement, the sheriff's office explained exactly what happened. That statement read, "The inmates took advantage of a new guard by using peanut butter to conceal an exit door number. When the inmates called for the guard to open the door and let them in the cell, the guard inadvertently opened the exit door." The BBC, having fun with this one, wrote, "It was not clear which variety of the paste was used by the prisoners, or whether it was crunchy or smooth." The US authorities did say the men were clever, but they weren't that clever because they were all rearrested shortly after tasting freedom. Number 2. The transvestite. The year was 2012, a year when a drug trafficker from Brazil decided he didn't want to spend any more time behind locked doors. His name is Ronaldo Silva, and during a visit with his wife, he just walked out of the prison. We're not sure what happened to the wife. What he had done was switch clothes with his loved one while she was visiting him. He then put on some lipstick that she had brought in and also donned a woman's wig and some high heels. Prior to this, we should say that he had a very close shave. He apparently got out of the prison, but someone later told police that a strange-looking man not walking very well was hanging around a bus stop. Police then arrested him. You can see the photos online of how he looked dressed as a woman. And you might agree with us that it's frankly amazing he got 1 foot out of the visiting room. Number 1. Mass escape from the maze. This might be the biggest prison escape in history, but if not, it's certainly the biggest in terms of numbers that the UK has ever seen. That's because 35 prisoners got out. It was in 1983, and this group all belonged to the Irish Republican Army. They made it out of a prison in Belfast, Northern Ireland called Maze. We won't call it too ingenious as it took some amount of violence to escape, but 35 nonetheless is a big number when we consider the facility was maximum security. With knives and smuggled guns, the group of inmates demanded that the officers they had hostage give them their clothes and car keys, and that they did under duress. An alarm was raised and there was mayhem in the prison, but with hostages it was a tricky situation. Later, the inmates got hold of a food truck and tried to drive it out of the gates, with some of the inmates dressed in officers' uniforms and so causing confusion. The officers blocked the gates with their cars, and so the men got out and proceeded on foot. Officers were shot and stabbed during this ordeal and 1 man died. Others were very seriously injured. 38 were in the escape gang, but 3 didn't make it out. It was called the biggest prison escape in Europe since World War II. 15 men were recaptured that same day and another 3 soon after. What happened to the rest is a long story, but some were killed, some were sent back to prison, and some were extradited from the USA. Out of the 38 that tried to get out that day, after many years, only 2 men have evaded arrest or being killed. When most people think of prisons, they think of someplace they're happy not to be. But not everyone. While we often hear of inmates trying to break out of jail to freedom, there are also some who try to break in for any of several reasons. Depending on their unique circumstances, they face different consequences for their actions. Let's find out what these could be in this episode of the Infographic Show. What happens if you break into prison? First of all, just what happens to you if you either attempt to or successfully break into a prison largely depends on who you are, your motivations, and what you did if you were lucky enough to make it in. Applicable laws may vary by state, not to mention by country. To find out what these consequences could be, let's look at some of the unlucky who have attempted to navigate a jail's defenses only to be caught and, in most cases, charged and sentenced. Sylvester Giles, for example, had formerly served time for manslaughter but was released from a Florida jail in 2009. He lasted 3 days in the great wide open before apparently missing the feeling of being boxed in. He first approached guards with a simple request to let him back inside. They obviously refused, after which he attempted to climb over the jail's walls. He may or may not have noticed the barbed wire on top before his climb, but it's safe to say he was well aware of it after. He got stuck in it and was caught. Because he was out on probation, in this instance he was in violation of his probation conditions and was sentenced to 15 more years in prison. While most would find this terrible news, we're sure he was quite oddly thrilled. Then there's Martin Yoshie, who, like Sylvester Giles, apparently didn't like being free, though instead of lasting 3 days outside bars, at least he made it to 3 years. After being paroled from Folsom Prison in California in 2008, he was found in the grass outside the facility in 2011. His location was given away due to handy thermal technology, which zeroed in on him as he climbed a fence. In this crazy world of crazies, we can almost believe his claims that he was just there to reminisce about his previous stay. However, it's much more likely that he was there in an attempt to smuggle in contraband instead. Unsurprisingly, he was charged and his bail was set at an impressive $1 million. Let's hope for his sake that any cash he made in his efforts to sneak things in amounted to anything close to that amount. In the case of Monique Armstrong, who was not out on parole, what she lacked in criminal history she made up for with limitless stupidity. Believe it or not, she actually called the police before attempting to gain unauthorized entry into a Colorado facility. She was able to navigate a chain fence and was trying to break windows to a building when she was spotted. All this was an attempt to get access to her 18-year-old brother, who was not even in that area of the property. She asked to be arrested, and those in charge were all too happy to oblige. This behavior earned her charges of criminal trespass and criminal mischief. Her brother, on the other hand, who'd she'd gotten into all this mess in order to see, walked out just hours later on bond. We're guessing he had better sense and didn't break back in to see his silly sister, though that would make a great story. Then there were those willing to put their freedom on the line for friends and family. Patrick Rempe of Florida, for instance, was arrested after he got tangled in the wire of a prison fence, though it was almost certain he'd been caught regardless. If you're curious why, we'll tell you. You see, before he started to climb the fence, he'd announced his presence by driving his car into the prison's front door. It seems that Rempe was high at the time on a drug known as flakka and just wanted to visit his buddies. This was somewhat of a problem, however, since they were prison inmates. He decided to pop in nonetheless, though he really didn't think it through as he couldn't navigate even one fence and the prison had two. Beyond these, there was also the issue of a locked door. Now, what does driving high, crashing your car into a jail, scaling its fence, and fighting back when you get caught get you? 3 felonies for criminal mischief, driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of a crash with property damage. Not to mention aggravated assault and battery on a law enforcement officer. In other words, it was really not pretty. Facing these charges, he was held without bond, but fortunately for him, this meant lots of opportunity to catch up with those friends. There seem to be fewer charges involved for those who attempt to bust into jail while intoxicated when they don't first crash their cars, destroy prison ground property, or fight the police. Tiffany Heard, for example, faced only one charge in the case of drunkenly attempting to enter the Butler County Jail in Ohio. She was yet another who was stopped short by a rather inconvenient fence. Again, like Monique Armstrong, she rather strangely requested to be arrested when found. This was in spite of the deputy present repeatedly trying to convince her to go home. It seems that not only breaking into prison but requesting to be thrown into jail happens more often than you'd think. Booze or not, due to her strange behavior, she was given the misdemeanor charge of disorderly conduct. Let's hope she didn't make her situation worse with a repeat offense by attempting to drink away her new problems. Nicholas Celius of New Orleans tried to infiltrate the recreation area of a jail in 2018 for much more nefarious reasons. He was noticed but escaped only to abandon his backpack, which was holding quite an impressive stash of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. He was captured not long after. In addition to resisting an officer, he faced charges of drug possession. And then there was the matter of an outstanding warrant from the state of Texas. While Celius had been nabbed, however, 2 others on the scene were not as easy for the cops to pick up. At the time of his arrest, these accomplices remained at large as well as unidentified. Then we have a strange case involving some alcohol in the country down under of Australia. Apparently it was here that in the summer of 2014, detainees were leaving its Berrima jail and then turning around and re-entering. While free, they would go out and have some fun drinking. However, they made sure to return each and every day before prisoners were accounted for first thing in the morning. Unfortunately for those involved, their activities were revealed when some of the men brought attention to themselves by fighting over a cellular phone. This left authorities in quite a confusing position as they tried to figure out what charges they could level on the offenders for breaking out but then breaking back in. Believe it or not, we have an even odder situation involving a planned break-in in Queensland, Australia. Here, 2 young women in their 20s went to a restricted area outside of a Brisbane correctional facility and stood suspiciously by its fence. They were discovered, and the reason they gave for their actions defies all logical reason. Apparently, the women had watched far too many episodes of a popular crime-based drama called Wentworth, and they wanted to know if a real-life prison was interesting. Though searched and found to have nothing suspicious on them, they still faced charges of unlawful entry. The event inspired a police officer to remind the public that correctional institutions are serious places and not tourist destinations. For Serhiy Vlasenko, his reasons for crawling under the fence of a prison made much more sense, and as far as we can tell, got him no consequences. Then again, he was a lawyer representing a former Ukrainian prime minister who was supposedly being denied satisfactory healthcare behind bars. In addition to allegedly skimping on medical treatment, they must have also been trying to save money with limited guards. When Vlasenko arrived, there was no one there to let him in, or as others believe, they were purposefully denying him entry, with a rather peculiarly timed break. Whatever the reason, Vlasenko was less than patient. Without anyone to give him access, the lawyer resorted to a rather unlawyer-like behavior by entering via the bottom of the fence. The chief of the prison labeled this as voluntary trespassing. Vlasenko, on the other hand, claimed that to see his client, such actions were necessary. Though he may have escaped punishment in this instance, the lawyer ultimately got hit with other legal issues involving a messy divorce and alleged theft. So aside from obvious amusement, what can we take away from all of these unique situations? Well, it appears at the very least that someone attempting to bust into jail will be leveled with some type of charge for trespassing. If they're drunk or high when they do it, they can be charged with disorderly conduct, or in the unusual instance where it's applicable, driving under the influence. Doing things like attempting to break windows can get you hammered with an additional charge of criminal mischief. If breaking in to sell illicit substances, you can add drug possession to the list. And of course, failure to cooperate once identified never goes over well, and you can be accused of assault and battery on an officer or attempt to resist. If out on parole, you can expect to land right back behind the bars that you came from. Fortunately for all involved, there's nothing technically criminal about being silly or downright stupid. And not that you should need such a warning, but as these stories show, if you try to break into a jail, there are many reasons why you likely won't succeed or get very far. In the case of Nicholas Celius, for instance, the jail he attempted to breach had more than 800 cameras on hand. With such thorough surveillance, he really didn't stand a chance. Then let's not forget the formidable prison ground fencing. Its wires snagged Sylvester Giles, Patrick Rempe, and Tiffany Hurd, among others who would otherwise have successfully entered. Then there's things like locked doors, shatterproof windows, and thermal imaging technology that work against potential intruders. Of course, in addition to these things, there are many other security measures in place. And if you call the police beforehand or drive your car into the prison, you have pretty much zero chance of evading detection. So you've been nicked. Your life on the lam is over, and you're finally going to pay for your evil ways. On the first day of your court case, you were judged so evil and vile that the jury decided they didn't even want to hear any further evidence. And now you've been sentenced to a life sentence in prison. Life in prison really cramps up your plans though, and you've decided that you'd rather not sit in prison until you die. How are you going to get out of this one? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're going to show you how to escape from prison. To help us with this episode, we've gotten the expert advice of an actual working prison guard with the Nevada Corrections Department. Because who best to teach you how to break out of prison than one of the guys whose job is to make sure you don't? Before we begin, he gives us this piece of sage advice. When it comes to breaking out of prison, his advice is, don't. You won't succeed. And in the incredibly low chance that you actually do, you'll be very quickly reapprehended. Of all the escaped convicts in the last 60 years in America, there exists less than a dozen who've managed to remain free. Not only are you probably not going to succeed, you're only going to add more time to your sentence, ruin your chance for parole, or if already serving a life sentence, be locked up in solitary for months, maybe even years at a time. Our prison guard expert tells us that solitary should be enough of a threat to anyone. He's seen the biggest, baddest inmates break down into a sobbing mess after just a few weeks, locked up all alone for 23 hours a day. If you think solitary is a joke, consider that you'll be locked up all day and all night long with bright lighting that never dims, a single blanket to cover yourself with, extremely restricted personal materials to include 2 or 3 books, and a pad of paper to write with, and almost no phone calls or family visits. We're gonna go ahead and disregard our experts' advice and plot our prison escape anyways though, because if Jenny McCarthy can convince us all not to vaccinate our kids, we don't need any expert telling us what we should or shouldn't do. Prison escape strategy 1. Fake gun. John Dillinger was one of America's most notorious bank robbers, and at one point he was famously locked up in a jail which the local sheriff had bragged was escape-proof. This was after Dillinger had escaped from a previous jail, so the sheriff had posted extra guards just to make sure that there would not be a repeat. Yet, while the guards were on the lookout for threats from the outside, the last prison escape Dillinger had been busted out by friends. Dillinger was working on an internal plot to earn his freedom. Sources differ, but most agree that Dillinger used a wooden gun that he had carved from a block of wood and then painted black with shoe polish in order to force his way out of his cell. Then, he seized a submachine gun and, armed with a real weapon, went on to steal the sheriff's car and drive himself to freedom. Other sources claim the gun was made from a potato, while even others say the fake gun was actually smuggled in by one of his attorneys. So what does our expert say about fashioning a fake weapon in order to escape with? First, he doubts that Dillinger fashioned the weapon himself, asking what are the odds Dillinger was a skilled enough craftsman to make a believable gun from a block of wood. He suspects that the fake gun was smuggled in, but then wonders why not just give him a real gun. There were no metal detectors in jails or prisons back then, so the only reason he can think of is perhaps the attorney believed he would get in less trouble if discovered with a fake gun. On the prospect of doing this today though, our expert is extremely skeptical. First of all, very few prison guards are actually armed, and those that are carry rifles and are separated from the general population. Guards may carry sidearms, but only when escorting a prisoner outside of the prison grounds. So if you were to believably fashion a gun for yourself, you'd have to make sure it looked exactly like a 9mm Beretta or a .45 caliber pistol, which would require a pretty well-developed artistic talent to make it look real. Dillinger got off easy as he likely just recreated a .38 Special, a small and relatively easy gun to recreate. The second problem you'd face is acquiring the materials and tools in the first place. Inmates are regularly searched for contraband, as are their cells, and making an accurate-looking modern pistol is going to take a long time. While things such as shanks are typically easy to hide because of their general shape, a pistol is altogether a very different matter and will stick out like a sore thumb. There's also the fact that shanks tend to be very crudely made because it's difficult to find good materials to work with, but your pistol will have to pass the smell test in front of a guard who's been trained to handle one their entire life. Our expert doesn't buy the fake pistol strategy, but does point out that if Dillinger made the gun himself, he likely carved it out of a potato, as that would be easier to get a hold of and work with. Prison escape strategy 2. Tunnel out of a cell and paddle to safety. Our next strategy comes straight from the annals of criminal history. On June 11, 1962, Alcatraz inmates Frank Lee Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin managed the impossible, escaping from what was thought to be the most inescapable prison in America. The trio used handmade tools to dig a tunnel through their cell walls over the course of a year, and from there managed to get into a ventilation shaft and reach the roof. Once there, they climbed down and scaled a fence, then assembled a raft that they had made out of raincoats and rubber cement that they had stolen. Pumping up the raft with a modified accordion, the men took off into the icy waters of the San Francisco Bay and into the pages of history. So all you have to do is tunnel through your cell's wall to hit an access corridor or ventilation shaft, and then ride a homemade raft to sweet, sweet freedom, or more than likely an icy death. What does our expert say? First, our expert points out that Alcatraz used to be an old military fort and was not designed to be an actual prison, just converted to one. This meant that there were several vulnerabilities to the facility that inmates could have used to escape, and this included the weak cement around the cell ventilation shafts. Modern prisons, however, are built from the ground up to be escape-proof, with each cell often being prefabricated as a single solid steel enclosure with small openings for attaching water and ventilation pipes. Modern ventilation pipes, however, are just a few inches and impossible for a man to squeeze through. Enclosed by a steel shell, you won't be tunneling your way through anything without the aid of some heavy-duty power tools, let alone the homemade picks that the Alcatraz trio had fashioned. Then there's also the fact that regular inspections check each cell for any signs of tampering, not just contraband. So you can forget the Shawshank fantasy of hiding your escape tunnel behind a poster on the wall. As far as fashioning an entire raft in life jackets from stolen materials, our experts tell us that that's actually the most achievable part of this prison escape plan. Inmates are incredibly sneaky and incredibly patient. And with enough time and patience, it's remarkable how much raw material you can get your hands on if you just steal a few scraps at a time. Finding a place to actually hide all that contraband inside your modern, ultra-sleek prison cell, though, is a different matter altogether. Sadly, it seems that this escape plan is dead on arrival in the modern age. Prison Escape Plan 3 – Fake it till you make it. In 1971, notorious conman Frank Abagnale of Catch Me If You Can fame managed to con his way out of jail. Upon being transferred to the Federal Detention Center in Atlanta, Georgia in 1971, Frank discovered that the U.S. Marshal assigned to him had forgotten his detention commitment papers as they arrived. Taking advantage of the confusion caused by the lack of documentation, Frank was able to convince the local guards that the reason the papers were missing was because he was actually a prison inspector and not a prisoner. He did this with the help of an outside accomplice who pretended to be a federal agent. Yet, Frank didn't immediately try to get the guards to let him out, but rather grew their confidence by dragging out the con for weeks, pretending to be gathering intelligence on the prison and its operations. Then, he finally earned enough of the guards' trust that they actually allowed him to meet his accomplice outside of the prison walls inside a parked car. And from there, Frank disappeared. So forget tunneling or making fake guns. Let's try some diplomacy and smooth talking. What does our expert say about this plan? This one is the most realistic of our prison escape plans, he says. People can be incredibly gullible, even prison staff, and some inmates can be incredibly charming or persuasive. Then there's also the fact that most ground floor prison staff simply isn't privy to big overarching administrative operations, such as the insertion of an undercover agent posing as a prisoner, which does happen from time to time, but typically in order to monitor or bust up gang activity. So our expert tells us that the odds of fooling prison guards into believing that you're actually an undercover agent is pretty high if you're a smooth enough talker, let alone if you have outside help to verify it. However, back in the day, the prison system was pretty patchwork, and each prison acted largely independently, without much communication between them and certainly not with the federal government. Since then, though, the prison system has become deeply entangled bureaucratically, and the invention of the internet lets wardens be in constant and easy communication with any federal agency. Trying to pull this stunt in the modern age is simply impossible, as not only would a prison warden be notified of any undercover agents inserted into his prison, but even if he wasn't, verifying the credentials of a possible agent would be as easy as sending an email. Unless your outside contact works directly with the FBI or other major government organization, convincing a warden in the modern age that you're an undercover agent is next to impossible. There's just too many ways to disprove your story. It turns out escaping from a modern prison is way harder than we thought. And though we thought we could outsmart the man and bust you out of jail, it looks like you're stuck serving your full sentence. As our expert tells us, the best way to bust out of prison is simply never get sent to it in the first place, or to have a really good lawyer. But as far as getting out on your own, it's just not going to happen. Though he does admit that it still happens from time to time. Each time, though, federal agents coordinate with state agents to discuss the specific escape strategy that the last inmate or inmates used, and then work to close those loopholes at their facilities. So each time someone successfully escapes, they make it that much harder for the next guy. Sorry, but it looks like you're on your own for this one. Just don't drop the soap. On May 4th, 2015, officers from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office in Florida were following through on a tip. The Regional Gang Task Force was about to make an unusual arrest, and in so doing, they would help the U.S. Marshals close their longest-running manhunt ever to catch a fugitive. On a stretch of marshland near the western edge of Melbourne, Florida, hidden by thickets of palm trees, sat the isolated, run-down, algae-streaked trailer that was home to a 79-year-old trucker, amateur guitarist, and suspected outlaw, known as William Cox. When Cox answered the door, one of the officers held up an old black and white photo of an Ohio man named Frank Freshwaters. He asked if Cox recognized the man in the 1957 mugshot. Cox responded that he hadn't seen that man for a long time. Pressing, the cop followed up, "Are you that man?" And indeed, he was. Once, Cox went off with the police without protest. His life had come full circle, and his 55 years and 7 months on the lam were at an end. Frank Harold Freshwaters was the real name of a man who'd been living under the alias of William Cox since 1959. When he fled from a prison camp in northern Ohio, Freshwaters had served part of his sentence at the Ohio State Reformatory in the city of Mansfield. That imposing castle-like complex is where the well-loved 1994 film The Shawshank Redemption was shot. And so, perhaps inevitably, news reports following Freshwater's 2015 arrest dubbed him the Shawshank Fugitive. Does that mean this is the real-life story behind the movie? Well, the short answer is no. The connection was always fairly tenuous. The Shawshank Redemption, which starred Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, is based on a Stephen King novella that is a work of fiction. Both the movie and the story take place in Maine, not Ohio, the location of filming notwithstanding. The action takes place between the 1940s and the 1960s, and so it does overlap with the period when Freshwaters was an inmate at the penitentiary in Ohio. But whereas the Andy Dufresne, the protagonist in Frank Darabont's movie, and King's story, spends the better part of 2 decades behind bars at the equally fictional Shawshank State Penitentiary, Freshwaters was only locked up in the Mansfield, Ohio prison for a matter of months. He soon received a transfer to a minimum security facility. Dufresne eventually makes his getaway by chiseling a small hole in the stony prison walls. Freshwaters wasn't even being held at the Ohio State Reformatory when he made his escape. And while the character Dufresne, a banker, was innocent of the double homicide for which he was wrongfully convicted, Freshwaters was guilty and remorseful for the crime that defined his early life. So it's a very different story, but in its own way, it's quite a cinematic tale as well. At a little after 11 p.m. on July 3, 1957, Eugene Flint, aged 24, an Army veteran and father of 3, was getting home from his late shift working at the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. From across the street, his wife Garnet saw Eugene get out of the truck and went to put coffee on for him. Young Frank Freshwaters worked for another rubber company. Rubber and tires were what put Akron on the map, and it was a boom time for the car industry. And that night, Frank was burning some rubber himself, tearing down the street in his 1953 Mercury at 50 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Hearing a crash, Garnet Flint turned to see her husband get hit and go flying. Eugene Flint died from his injuries in a hospital less than an hour later. Police cited Freshwaters for a non-working car horn and broken emergency brake, either one of which might have prevented or mitigated the accident. But the real-life charge he'd face would be manslaughter. At trial, Freshwaters already expressed horror at his own actions, crying as he pleaded to the judge, "It's not something like a nightmare which is gone in a day, it stays with you." The comment was prescient. Freshwaters gave a lowball estimate of his speed behind the wheel, which didn't stick. But the sentence ended up being quite lenient for Freshwaters, who was 22 at the time of the trial the following April. His 16-year-old wife Patricia had given birth to their first son 6 months earlier. For his crime, Freshwaters was given a prison term of 1 to 20 years, but the sentence was suspended. That meant he never had to see the inside of a cell, so long as he abided by his 5-year probation. The terms included not driving a car and paying $5 per week in restitution to Garnet Flint. The sum would only be around $44 in 2019 money, but was to offer at least some assistance to the widow and her children. Nonetheless, the apparently cash-strapped Freshwaters failed to keep up the payments. On top of that, he was caught driving with a fake license. So the prison sentence became active and Freshwaters was sent to the facility in Mansfield. But once at the penitentiary, Freshwaters quickly developed a reputation as a cooperative inmate. Thus, he was transferred from the Osborne Honor Farm, adjacent to the city of Sandusky, Ohio, and just inland from Lake Erie. The farm grew vegetables and hogs used for food elsewhere in Ohio's prison system, and would have been a relief compared to the stultifying conditions at the Ohio State Reformatory. Freshwaters was assigned to work in the mess hall of the nearby Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Home, a nursing facility for veterans a short distance from the farm itself. On September 31, 1959, Freshwaters and another inmate made their escape. They were last spotted on the road outside the home heading south just before 5 p.m. Both were in prison garb, blue jeans with red stripes and gray and white striped shirts. The exact circumstances for the escape aren't recorded. However they did it that afternoon would be the last time anyone saw or heard from Frank Freshwaters for a long time. Not long after the escape, the state of Florida issued a driver's license to one William Cox, and thus was born the identity that the fugitive would hold for more than 5 decades. We'll stick with that name for now. It's essentially a new identity he adopted. Cox soon moved to a dot of a town, Hurricane, West Virginia. For 16 years, he built a second life in that state, settling down with his new significant other, Joyce Wade, and raising a son. Ironically, given his record, Cox worked as a truck driver. A ninth-grade dropout himself, he also spent time driving a mobile library around to promote childhood literacy. His work caring for horses earned him the nickname Cowboy. He rode in local parades. But Cox and Wade became estranged, and Joyce reported that she feared violence from her ex. When police came around Cox's home near Charleston to deliver a peace warrant, similar to a restraining order, they discovered him hiding in a special compartment he built under his sink. The odd hiding place may have backfired, leading to more suspicion than, for instance, not hiding under the sink. The deputies took him into custody, fingerprinted him, and learned his true identity. Wade stopped pursuing her case against Cox, but he clearly had bigger problems at hand. Held in the jail of Kanawha County, in which the state capital of Charleston is located, Cox shared his already convoluted true story. Probably the proximity to state government helped the case find its way to West Virginia's then Governor Arch Moore, who became an advocate for Cox, vocally denying Ohio their extradition request. Moore claimed that the complaint Wade had filed was bogus, but the actual or perceived threat Wade felt remains a matter of debate. Wade failed to show at her court hearings against Cox, and later she didn't wish to revisit the chapter of her life. As far as Moore was concerned, Cox, the name he would continue using, was a reformed citizen, and welcome to continue life as a free man, with a special provision for his monitoring by the state of West Virginia. And that was that for about 10 years. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Cox became involved with another woman in West Virginia named Brenda, and the two moved to Melbourne, Florida in 1987, along with his son Jim Cox, by then 16. Jim, who would stick by his dad, later noted that the backstory was no secret. He knew who his father was. As his son relates, Cox wasn't so much on the run as fully ensconced in his new life. The move to Florida may well have been motivated by more yearning for warm weather than any desire to lay low. As before, Cox got work as a trucker, hauling trees for a family who owned a large stretch of marshlands on the western edge of the city. Part of the deal was that he'd keep an eye on their property, which was prime trespassing territory for off-road vehicle enthusiasts and poachers, and they gave him a trailer to live in. A bit cold and leaky in the wintertime, Cox reasoned that it wasn't as cold as Ohio could get. Following the loss of his wife Brenda to cancer in 1999, he was on his own in his dilapidated trailer home. But by now, Cox was again growing close to his neighbors in the new community, who knew him as an affable cheapskate who loved country music and fried chicken. He stood up as best man for Cheryl Cheatham, a close female friend and hunting companion at her wedding. Her kids knew him as Grandpa Bill. But in 2015, the Northern Ohio office of U.S. Marshals launched a cold case division, and they didn't get much colder than Cox, aka Frank Freshwaters. It's not that hard to track down a fugitive who's not really even hiding. Cox's cover had been blown for decades, and unlike in West Virginia, in Florida there was no one who would fight Ohio's extradition order. The uneventful operation to take Cox in and send him to Ohio went forward. Frank Freshwaters was back. U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott, who had created the cold case squad, commented that he didn't have any opinion regarding whether Freshwaters deserved additional charges or additional jail time. In Elliott's view, if there was a prison escapee on the loose, it was the job of the U.S. Marshals to bring him in, and essentially, it would be up to the courts to handle the rest. As Freshwaters awaited trial in a jail facility for handicapped prisoners in Ohio, again a compliant model prisoner, friends and family showed their support in writing, in pictures, and on social media. The prosecution noted correctly that Freshwaters still owed restitution to the Flint family, who still felt the trauma of Eugene Flint's death 6 decades later. The state pushed for the reinstatement of a 4-year prison sentence based on the original conviction. They declined to press any additional charges for the escape from custody. But in February 2016, the sentence given was very similar to that handed down in 1958, 5 years parole. Freshwaters, now nearly 80, could only walk very short distances and had trouble hearing. His ill-fitting dentures rattled around. There would be little opportunity for him to violate the terms of his release this time around. There was some delay as the state of Ohio made sure that there was a provision for where Freshwaters would stay once released. Finally, on June 15, 2016, Frank Freshwaters smiled as he walked out of state custody for the last time to go and live with his son in West Virginia, looking forward to a return to a private life after his last round of media attention. As a prison officer delivers the daily serving of miso soup to Yoshie Shiratori's cell, it takes all his concentration not to break into an evil grin. He wishes he could laugh at the man and call him a fool. Do they really think they can keep him contained this time around, after failing so many times already? Of course, he doesn't want to give himself away, so he stays quiet and watches the man leave. Now it's time for the fun to begin. Shiratori will make use of whatever tools are available to him, and it just so happens that now the only thing he has to work with is a concoction made of fermented soybeans. A challenge, sure, but nothing a bit of creativity can't solve. He tucks into his meal hungrily, but instead of swallowing, he stands up while retaining the liquid in his mouth. Time to get to work. He spits the food onto the doorframe, mouthful after mouthful. Then he spits a bit more on his handcuffs. Just what is he doing? Well, they don't call him Japan's answer to Houdini for nothing. These officers have no idea what's about to hit them. Yoshie Shiratori was born in 1907 during the Meiji era in Japan, which lasted from 1868 to 1912, and was notorious for its harsh prison conditions. Harsher prison conditions means a greater incentive to escape, and Shiratori wasn't the only one to come to that conclusion. For instance, in 1881, almost 2,000 prisoners escaped from their cells. But before you can escape, you first have to be convicted. And for Yoshie Shiratori, that conviction was a big one, found guilty of robbery and murder. You never forget the first prison, or at least that's how the saying goes. For Shiratori, it was Aomori Prison, which was a horrible place. So how did he get out after just 3 years, well short of his original sentence? Well, for Shiratori, it was all very easy, really. One evening, the guards handed him a bucket of water to wash with, and as he looked down into the water, he noticed a tiny glimmering strip staring up at him. Checking his surroundings to ensure nobody was watching, he picked it up to find it was a tiny wire. A tiny wire might not sound like something to write home about if you're living a cushy life complete with human rights and all that jazz, but for Shiratori, it was a miracle. Instantly, he realized he could use it to pick the lock of his handcuffs and escape, so he hid it out of sight. The lock-picking took a bit of trial and error, but there's nothing better to do with your time in a prison cell. Shiratori enjoyed a few good years of sweet, sweet freedom. Unemployment too, but at least he was free. The problem was he got too comfortable. The life of crime was calling Shiratori, and he so badly wanted to answer that call. One day, he just couldn't resist stealing some supplies from a hospital. Big mistake. In 1936, the powers that be recaptured Shiratori, and this time it was a life sentence. But now he went into prison already thinking about the ways to escape, and he was determined to make it an even better story than the last time. The next stop was Akita Prison. Not the most memorable place, but it just so happened to be where he conducted an even cooler exit. As soon as they put him into his cell, he started surveying his surroundings. There were no wires this time, but after what felt like hours of pacing, he gave up and settled down on his poor excuse for a bed. Laying down on his bed, looking up at the ceiling, he was struck with inspiration. Right in the top corner of the wall by the ceiling was an air vent, and everybody knows an air vent has to lead somewhere. It was his getaway ticket. But there was a problem. The walls in his cell were very high and extremely smooth. Even if it was possible to force the door to the air vent open and make his way through to the other side without killing himself, how would he ever climb the wall? Figuring that out became Shiratori's hobby for the rest of his time in Akita. After weeks on end of perfecting his scaling technique, one day he finally made it up to the top and then he fell down. Great, but at least he had the ability to make it up, right? Shiratori eventually managed to get up to the top and stay there long enough to undo the hinge that was keeping the door closed. There was only one part left now, to take the exit route. Shiratori waited until the time when the prison got quiet, then scaled up the wall and busted open the air vent, clambering in sweatily before his bare feet lost grip on the walls. Now he just had to crawl through a horribly small passageway for who knows how long without the claustrophobia giving him a panic attack and force open the door on the other end. Easy. It was a tense journey, but finally he reached the end of the tunnel. Shiratori didn't really have a great view of what was waiting for him on the other side. It was impossible to tell if there were many people out there, but it seemed to be silent. He took a deep breath, scrambled out, then snuck out of the prison without being seen. Success. Then it was back to the same old problem. He had absolutely nowhere to go. Shiratori had no money, no friends or family he could trust to protect him. He couldn't just go and get a job, they'd realize he was a prisoner, so Shiratori was stuck in a revolving door of crime. But then he remembered a specific prison guard from Aomori Prison, one who always gave him a warm smile and made sure he had enough food. Maybe he would help him. It was a long shot turning to a prison guard for refuge, but what else was a prisoner on the run supposed to do? Miraculously, Shiratori was able to find him, and even more miraculously, he took him in. For a while, things were going well. He loved Shiratori's stories and appreciated the company, but after a while, Shiratori noticed that he wasn't looking him in the eye. That's never a good sign, and not long after, the police arrived at the door to arrest Shiratori again. He'd been betrayed. That night, Shiratori made an oath to himself that he'd never trust another officer again. This time, they sent him to Abashiri Prison. He was really in with the big fish this time. Abashiri was the destination of hardened criminals and the most dangerous place in Japan. This cell didn't even have an air vent. That traitor guard had probably told the staff exactly how he'd escaped the previous times. But nobody could have guessed what Shiratori had in store this time around. Every meal, the officers would dish up a serving of miso soup. It was bitter and horrible stuff, but conveniently his plan ensured that he didn't have to eat it. Each morning, Shiratori would spit the soup onto his door frame and his handcuffs. The salt and moisture from the miso had corroded and weakened the door frame and the handcuffs. It was a long game, sure, but he had nothing but time. Although salt water alone can't cause rust, it does accelerate the process. Rusting happens because metal atoms react with oxygen and water, and because there's almost always some moisture in the air, most iron is exposed to both of these. This results in hydrated iron oxide. Electrons move more easily in salt water than fresh water since it contains a lot of dissolved ions, so the rusting process takes place more quickly. Shiratori gradually wore down the door frame over time, making it looser and looser until finally he could create a larger gap on the metal frame the guards pushed the miso soup through. He also loosened his handcuffs. Now all he needed was an opportunity. Opportunity arrived when there was a wartime blackout in 1944. With no light and the minds of the prison staff on problems other than guarding the prisoners, he realized he might just be able to manage an escape. But as he pried apart the metal on the frame, he discovered that he wasn't going to make it through. The hole was too small. Unless Shiratori might just be able to squeeze himself through if he really forced it, but it was going to do his body some damage. But it was this or nothing. With all his might, he rammed himself through that gap, dislocating his shoulder in the process, and while the whole prison was dark and everyone was distracted, he successfully snuck away again. But Shiratori's story didn't end there. There was still one fourth and final escape. When he was recaptured, things were somehow worse than ever. His original sentence of a few years imprisonment had now become a death sentence. It was almost like escaping from prison hadn't been worth it. Yet he knew that with such high stakes, this time he had no choice but to get out. But Shiratori was well known for his escapes now and no longer had the element of surprise. Now he had 6 armed guards watching over him 24 hours a day. And even worse, the cell had been specially designed to ensure that he couldn't get out through the air vent. One of the few bright sides for Shiratori was no more handcuffs. The prison had so much faith in their sophisticated cell design and highly trained guards that they deemed them unnecessary, so at least he wouldn't have to waste time on spitting soup onto his wrists this time around. The other thing that caught his notice was the floor. He was on the ground floor this time, and the wooden floorboards looked like they could easily be lifted up if the bolts were removed. But even if he could, he'd still have to dig an entire tunnel before he had any hope of escaping, and this was going to take a while. By this point, Shiratori was an old man. All the escaping from prison and being recaptured had really taken a toll on him, and the prospect of the grueling manual labor involved in digging up a tunnel didn't exactly fill him with joy. But it was literally a matter of life and death. So every day he used his food bowl to dig a small part of the hole. It took a while, but finally he finished digging the tunnel and crawled to freedom. But again, Shiratori struggled to adjust to the world outside of prison, though he did manage to stay out of trouble for a year, at least. One day, Shiratori encountered a police officer. His body froze up on instinct after seeing him, remembering his promise to never trust another officer. But the man surprised him by offering a cigarette. These were the post-war days when cigarette prices were extortionate, so he couldn't help but feel touched by the gesture. Overwhelmed by the show of camaraderie, Shiratori blurted out that he'd escaped prison 4 times. It sounds like a stupid thing to say, but it's hard to go your whole life as the world's single greatest prison escape artist and not tell a single person. But of course, the officer snitched, and just like the last time, Shiratori returned to prison for the 5th and final time. But this time around, he at least got some special treatment. No more death sentence and the chance to go to the prison of his choice. He chose a prison in Tokyo and was eventually granted parole, getting to live the final 10 years of his life as a truly free man. Allied prisoners of war face off with nasty Nazis. Heroic American soldiers, together with calm and calculated British officers, plan to do the impossible. Dig 3 tunnels named Tom, Dick, and Harry and get everyone out of the camp. It's a brilliant plan. The Allied men are nothing but courageous. The Nazis, well, they're Nazis. Bullets fly, there's motorcycle mayhem and amazing stunts. 2 men steal an airplane and joyously fly over the German border. A hero fills your eyes with tears as he gets thrown into the cooler for yet another time. It's a jolly good show by all involved, even though the backs of the heads become home to made-in-Germany bullets. The end. So there you go. That's the condensed version of the 1960s Hollywood hit The Great Escape. The Brits are very British, the Germans so darn German, and the main American prisoner played by Steve McQueen, he's so cool he could walk through fire with a smile on his face. But there's a big but. When Hollywood does a based on a true story war movie, you can count on the fact that 9 times out of 10, the based part is very flexible, but the actual true story is amazing itself. In fact, we like the real version much better than the fictional version. It's all quite dark, naturally. This was war. Brutal things happened, perhaps too brutal for the sensitive minds of you regular moviegoers. The truth is bleak indeed. But the question is, did anyone actually escape? In 1942, when the Stalag Luft III camp got going, just about all the prisoners there were British and Commonwealth officers, although some were Polish soldiers too. The camp was in present-day Poland, then part of Nazi Germany. Come 1943, the north compound of the camp was home to the Brits, and a bit later the south side and later the west side was filled with captured men from the US Air Force. Each different compound had 15 huts. The huts were 3 by 3.7 meters with 15 bunk beds in each. When the camp was at its fullest, there were almost 11,000 inmates. Around 3/4 of them were from the US Air Force, with the rest being British, along with some other allies from Commonwealth nations such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. As for building escape tunnels, this was actually very hard to do because the huts were raised off the ground. If anyone went below the huts, they were very easy to spot. On top of that, the soil was a sandy color, so if a man was covered in the stuff, the Germans would get very suspicious. Very suspicious could mean a bullet to the brain. Even if the guys could get the soil off of them, where could they put the stuff where it wouldn't be seen? The Germans knew all of this, and so they believed there was no way these prisoners were going to escape. They were proud that they built an escape-proof camp. They also knew that because the soil was so loose, even if someone did manage to dig down, the tunnel would collapse, likely killing or injuring anyone in it. As we said, those forward-thinking Germans thought a lot about possible escapes, and that's why they had special microphones in the camp that would pick up any tunneling. Life in camp was not quite what you'd expect. Remember, a lot of these prisoners were officers, and while each side in the war was trying to kill each other, there was a certain amount of respect between enemies, especially when a man held a high rank. Life was certainly not all about torture and general barbarity as you might have thought, especially if you've heard about the horrors of some of the other German POW camps. The main reason for this hospitality was the German guards were mostly men fighting with the mighty German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Many honorable soldiers were part of the Luftwaffe, or at least they thought they were honorable. As British co-pilot Jimmy James would tell the BBC many years after the war, the camp staff were all members of the Luftwaffe and behaved, for the most part, in a civilized manner toward the prisoners. In the early days, particularly our relations with the Germans were good, provided that higher authority and the Nazi Party were kept at a distance. James talked about one of the German commanders at the camp he was at first, also run by the Luftwaffe, which was Camp Stalag Luft I. There, he said a Major von Stachelski one evening felt so sorry for the British prisoners that he sent them some crates of beer. James called him a humane and thoughtful man, but when the higher-ups found out about von Stachelski's kindness, he was relieved of his duties. James later became part of the escape team when he was sent to Stalag Luft III. The prisoners actually ate pretty well, very well compared to the starved men in some camps that looked a day away from death. The prisoners got parcels from the Red Cross and from families back home, while the Germans gave them a daily diet constituting of almost 2,000 calories. POWs could also earn in the camp as they were paid by the Germans. You heard that right. What was called camp money was supposed to help prevent escape attempts. They used a camp currency that prisoners could use to buy goods, and on occasion beer that was brewed by the Germans. Believe it or not, the British government took money away from its officers knowing that they were being paid. This was something said in an official report. Health of POWs is good. Calisthenics are compulsory by order of the senior American officers. Adequate medical care is provided by British and French doctors. Dental care is not satisfactory, and difficulty is experienced in obtaining glasses. Washing and toilet facilities are adequate, although hot water is scarce. Athletics were second only to reading as the most popular diversion. Camp areas were cleared and made fit playing fields at first for cricket and rugby, and later for softball, touch football, badminton, deck tennis, and volleyball. In addition, POWs took advantage of opportunities for ping pong, wrestling, weightlifting, horizontal and parallel bar work, hockey, and swimming in the fire pool. POWs were also able to study and actually get degrees. They put on dramatic shows based on plays that were popular in London. They even built their own theater and a little radio station called Station KRGY. Two newspapers they published were called Circuit and Kriegi Times. The latter word is related to POW. Still, the Germans were paranoid about men escaping. It turned out, of course, that their paranoia was very much justified. The Allies were paranoid too, so when a new guy came to their barracks, they were vetted. Maybe they thought the new guy is an undercover agent for the Germans, reporting back about the activities on the prisoners. What's What's amusing is the Allies called the Germans goons. The Germans readily accepted the term, having been told it stood for German officer or non-com. The word goon was a relatively new word, slang most or all Germans wouldn't have understood. As we said, the Germans were right to be paranoid. Every single movement a German guard made outside of his quarters was tracked by the Allies, who wrote all the information down in a book. They knew who would be standing where or walking where at each time during the day and night. The Germans knew they were being monitored, but seemed to put up with it. One time they even got information from the prisoners about guards that had been rather lazy. Some of those 800 guards were past their prime. Others were slow on their feet due to having been injured. Okay, so the scene is set. Some of you might now be wondering why these POWs were so desperate to risk their lives and try to escape. Let's remember that prison is prison. These men wanted to rejoin the war or get back to their families. Some, though, didn't want to risk being shot for trying to escape. Jimmy James later wrote, "Of the 1,500 in the North Compound at Stalag Luft 3, only about 600 were in the escape organization. The others were interested. I would say about a third of the prisoners were, like myself, hardcore escapers. Of the others, some had been very keen in the early days but now thought it wasn't worth it, and the rest were either against it or just didn't think it was worthwhile. My motivation was simply freedom." The first notable escape was in 1943, which famously involved the prisoners using a wooden gymnastic vaulting horse to get away with digging holes. They could dig under it and they could put men in it. It was a genius thing, and 3 RAF soldiers escaped. The Great Escape took place a year later in 1944. RAF squadron leader Roger Bushell had for many months been thinking about an escape plan. Bushell's other main escape artist was British officer Jimmy Buckley. Together, and with other men, they were going to do the impossible. Bushell formed a British and Commonwealth Escape Committee and one day made his important announcement. This is how it went. Everyone here in this room is living on borrowed time. By rights, we should all be dead. The only reason that God allowed us this extra ration of life is so we can make life hell for the Hun. In North Compound, we are concentrating our efforts on completing and escaping through one master tunnel. No private enterprise tunnels are allowed. 3 bloody deep, bloody long tunnels will be dug. Tom, Dick, and Harry. One will succeed. Bushell thought that if the Germans found one tunnel, they wouldn't expect there to be another tunnel. They just needed manpower, which he got. He wanted over 200 men to escape when the time came. Unlike the Hollywood movie, Americans didn't really figure in the escape. About 600 men got to work secretly digging Tom, Dick, and Harry. Called those names because Bushell never wanted the word tunnel to be spoken. He even said anyone who says that word will be court-martialed, a very serious thing to happen to a soldier. Bushell knew that failure meant death. He could have no loose lips in the camp. The tunnels themselves were about 9 meters below the surface. They were tiny though, only about 0.6 meters square, just enough space for a man. It was hard to breathe in there, so at points in the tunnels the guys would dig a larger outlet for an air pump. Importantly though, getting through the tunnel was slow, with one man crawling at a time. As for the possibility of collapse, there was certainly some hairy moments, but the prisoners managed to steal a lot of wood from the camp, mainly from beds, to use as support beams. To dig, they used metal taken from cans of food to fashion little shovels. Digging, of course, was time-consuming work, but how to get rid of the soil? Like the movie showed, the prisoners blocked their pants at the bottom, then put soil inside them. They'd walk around the camp letting little bits of the soil sprinkle everywhere. As they had hundreds of guys doing this, they could get rid of a lot of soil. 200 men in total made around 25,000 dumping trips. Since they walked and looked funny, they got the name penguins. The Germans in the meantime knew the prisoners were up to something, but they couldn't figure out what exactly. Then they caught some penguins in the act of dumping. Sensibly, the Germans transferred a bunch of guys to other camps. The most notable of them was the Canadian fighter pilot Wally Floody, who was one of the most important people behind the tunnel construction. It should be said here that some of the Germans inside the camp helped the Allies, as did some of the Germans outside the camp, who helped the prisoners with getting certain documents. A fair few anti-Nazi Germans provided practical assistance in tunnel construction, which meant they were risking their lives too. As time went on, the tunnel dick was used for storing important things such as compasses, maps, documents, and forged travel permits and clothes. All of this was required to get through Germany. Tom was then discovered by the Germans, after which it was blown up. Dick, although later retired as an escape route, functioned as another storage facility. Harry was undiscovered and almost completed. As we said, 200 men were chosen to escape. The first group was either important figures in the tunnel building, or they spoke German really well, or they'd been in trouble before and were close to some serious punishment. These guys had much higher chances of escape. In the second group, which were designated as the hard arsers, it was expected they would have a hard time escaping. They spoke little German and were given few documents. Capture and death were very much a possibility for these people, hence they were hard ass. On March 24th, as night fell, a soldier went into the tunnel. Only when he came out at the other end, he wasn't anywhere near as far as he thought he would be. He was actually dangerously close to the guard tower and not close enough to the safety of the woods. But one by one, men went through. It was terribly cold and snow laid on the ground, and that didn't help at all because they made footprints in the snow. There were other problems though, such as tunnel collapses and sentries walking around. So with only 10 men able to crawl through per hour, it was decided that 100 men would go in total. In all, 76 got out. When 77 made his way out, he was spotted by a guard, and the alarm was raised. Those prisoners already in the nearby forest scattered. The Germans flew from their huts, guns in hand. Those guys made their way as best they could in 5-foot deep snow. They headed toward various railway stations, which wasn't easy at all in snow, and their lives were certainly in the balance. Meanwhile, back at camp, the Germans were startled to see what those men had done. The German officers made a list of what had been used in the construction of the tunnel. That list included 4,000 bedboards, 90 complete double bunk beds, 635 mattresses, 192 bed covers, 161 pillowcases, 3,424 towels, and 1,700 blankets, 52 20-man tables, 10 single tables, 34 chairs, 76 benches, 1,212 bed bolsters, and 1,370 beating battens. 1,219 knives, 478 spoons, 582 forks, 69 lamps, 246 water cans, 30 shovels, 300 meters of electric wire, and 180 meters of rope. Those escapees trod through the deep snow, but they were like sitting ducks. 73 men were eventually picked up, and later on the orders of Adolf Hitler, they were sentenced to be shot. All of them. Hitler's main general said there might be a problem with conducting a massacre. They asked the boss, what will the Allies do with our prisoners if we do that? Hitler thought for a while and said, okay, more than half of them shall be executed. They were including Mr. Bushel, the brains of the operation, and he managed to travel 400 miles during his escape, but sadly was picked up when he was only 20 miles from the French border. 17 men were sent back to camp, and some were sent to other camps. 50 men were executed in all. 20 British, 6 Canadian, 6 Polish, 5 Australian, 3 South African, 2 New Zealander, and a few others from various nations. Most of them were told to turn around and then were shot from behind with a pistol or machine gun. Soon after, notices were pinned to other POW camps which read, "The escape from prison camps is no longer a sport." Jimmy James was one of the men that had trudged through the snow thinking he was almost home free. He later said it was freezing cold that night and we must have walked about 10 miles before we reached our objective, which was a country station called Chiebsdorf, where we knew we could take a train south. I was feeling terribly excited. The plan was that we'd get down to Czechoslovakia. He was asked for his papers in the railway station. He said he was just going to see his mother in Belgrade, which the officer didn't believe. James was subsequently taken along with some others to the police station to be interrogated. That didn't go too well. James later said, "It was only 12 hours since our escape. We were prisoners again and it was shattering. Our natural reaction was that we thought we were going to be taken back to the camp. In fact, they were taken off to be shot." He was transferred to another camp, one of the notorious killing camps. When he got there, he asked another prisoner where he was. The prisoner said, "This is Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The only way out of here is up the chimney." There, James said, people were tortured and starved and routinely shot dead. If any German so much as got a whiff of an escape plan, the POWs would be killed. In his own words, he said, "We knew the dangers of being in the cell block. You could smell the smoke from the crematorium. The SS sergeant who was in charge of it was a man who went around and murdered people in their cells with his own hands. His normal method was strangulation." In 2004, James, then an old man, returned to the place where the camp had been. He remarked, "I never thought 60 years ago when I crawled out of the hole in the snow that there would be a ceremony to commemorate the event. But remember, 76 men escaped and 73 were caught. What of the remaining 3 from the Great Escape?" They were Per Bergslund, a Norwegian pilot for the RAF, Jens Mueller, another Norwegian pilot for the RAF, and Bram van der Stok, a Dutch pilot for the RAF. Mueller later recalled his escape. "It took me 3 minutes to get through the tunnel. Above ground, I crawled along holding the rope for several feet. It was tied to a tree. Sergeant Bergslund joined me. We arranged our clothes and walked to the Sagan railway station. All 3 men went on to live long lives. The camp commandant, von Linwinder Wildau, was captured at the close of the war and spent some time in a camp in England called the London Cage. Even though 50 men had been massacred by the Germans, senior British officers testified that von Linwinder Wildau had treated them humanely. Anyway, it wasn't his decision to execute the escapees. He died aged 82, having long since returned to Germany. Nonetheless, some Gestapo and German military personnel were found guilty of war crimes for what became known as the Stalag Luft III massacres. By this time, many of those involved were already missing or dead. 13 were tried for the crime and executed. Some were imprisoned. One of the last survivors involved in the Great Escape didn't think it was all that great at all. He was the Australian pilot Paul Royal. When he reached the age of 100 in 2014, when asked about the escape, he said, "While we all hoped for the future, we were lucky to get the future. We eventually defeated the Germans, and that was that." He died aged 101. The grim reality is, he was fortunate enough to not get the bullet to the back of the head. Until he was released, he spent the rest of his time at the camp half-starved in solitary confinement, thinking about his murdered friends. He loathed the movie because it glamorized such a shameful event in the history of human existence. He said there were no heroics, just darkness, cold, and terror. He added, kid, the movie I disliked intensely because there were no motorbikes and the Americans weren't there. Let's just hope none of you get your education from movies based on a true story. The year is 2015, and Mexican crime kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman is making his way through a tunnel that stretches from his shower stall at Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1 maximum security prison to a construction site not far away. This may have been the most brazen and most costly prison escape of all time. Sure, in 1962, 3 men may have successfully escaped Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, but did they really survive the cold water and live a full and fruitful life on the outside? The jury is still out on that one. As for El Chapo, his freedom didn't last long, and right now he has less of a chance of breaching his new prison walls than gold bullion stands a chance of walking out of Fort Knox. Maximum security is no joke, and today you'll find out why. Before we talk about the impossible, meaning escaping from the most secure facilities out there, let's have a look at some examples of when prisoners managed to escape, if only for a short time. One of the most feared prisons in the US is Louisiana State Penitentiary, a place that has at times been called the Alcatraz of the South. It has a reputation for being a brutal place to do your time and is not an easy place to escape from. So you might wonder how, in 1999, death row prisoner Leslie Dale Martin and 3 other men managed to leave the prison and taste freedom. When you're locked down 23 hours a day and under strictest supervision, there aren't too many options open to you. In many prisons, even when you are allowed out of your cell, fresh air time is just another cage, albeit a larger cage. So what do? The answer for these men was to bribe prison guards. If a guard's wage doesn't quite pay the bills, maybe some of them can be enticed with a bribe. That's exactly what the men did. They paid at least one guard to bring hacksaws into the prison. For weeks, the prisoners slowly sawed through the bars on the cell doors and windows, a procedure that might sound a little bit cliched in the prison escape canon, but hey, evidently it can work. It seems they might have also paid a guard to turn a blind eye to their sawing. The men got out of the prison and over the walls and made a run for it, but the alarm was soon raised and a chase team with bloodhounds went after them. They were soon all caught. In the aftermath, 2 corrections officers were fired and 2 were demoted. We should say that Martin planned another escape after that, but this time it involved taking hostages. If you can bribe an officer, or better, a few officers, that could be your best chance of escaping from a maximum security prison. But what about taking hostages? Could that work? Well, we don't need to go any further from Louisiana State Penitentiary to answer that. We don't even need to change the year. Not long before Martin made his short-lived escape, 4 convicted murderers got out. It looks like they too had managed to bribe a guard because it was revealed that guns had been smuggled into the prison and hidden inside a box in the wall. The prisoners retrieved those guns, and with them, they took a maintenance supervisor hostage. It was a predicament for the other officers inside the prison. There isn't much you can do when a gun is being held at an innocent man's head. In this case, the prisoners walked out of the prison with their hostage at their side. They then drove him to some nearby woods, tied him up, and ran for it. Simple, but effective. It didn't take long for the authorities to catch up with them. 2 men were caught soon after they fled into the woods, and 2 others were rearrested around 5 hours later. One man who was cornered put a gun to his own head as he really didn't want to go to prison again. So, as you've heard, escaping maximum security prison has been done using fairly old-school methods, notably bribing and hostage-taking. There have been much more elaborate escapes, ones that didn't require the cash and connections that El Chapo had. Take, for instance, the Texas 7. They escaped in 2000 from the John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security state prison in the state of Texas. Their escape involved overpowering 9 civilian maintenance supervisors and 4 correctional officers as well as other inmates. Once they had those guys restrained, they removed their clothes and changed into them. They then left their victims gagged and tied up. With some in civilian clothes and some others in officers' uniforms, they started pretending to be other people working in the prison, and they were good at it. They not only managed to get out of the prison, but they also took lots of guns from the armory. They stole a maintenance pickup truck, and there was also a getaway car waiting for them outside the prison gates. Like the Alcatraz escape that may or may not have been successful, in the escape canon we can call this one elaborate. It took lots of planning. The men had to know where the guards were at all times. They even had to pick the right guards to overpower and steal clothes from. They basically had to plan the escape like someone might plan a very lucrative heist. Another escape has been compared to that of the Texas 7. This was back in the 70s, and it also involved a group of men, this time 6. Their escape from the maximum security facility Mecklenburg Correctional Center has been called the boldest and most elaborate escape in U.S. history. It certainly falls into the elaborate category of escapes, and if it weren't for the fact that those men were vicious killers, you might even call their escape funny. On that fateful day when they got out of the supposedly escape-proof prison, they overpowered the guards after much careful study. They too had spent months watching the guards and had even sized them up so they knew which guards' uniforms would fit them. This time, the guys got dressed up in riot gear too, including riot helmets. At this point, they had the guards tied up, leaving them fearing for their lives. One of the guards many years later said, "I had just had a baby. She was all I could think about, dying and not seeing my daughter anymore." They told the guards, "Keep your mouth shut and you won't get hurt." Meanwhile, they had taken a gurney and placed a TV in the middle of it. They then threw a blanket over the TV and radioed to other officers, telling them the thing they had was a bomb. Confused officers didn't know they were communicating with inmates, so they were asked to open the doors, and they opened them. What they saw was two men carrying the bomb, the TV, and two other men spraying it with fire extinguishers. Yeah, it might sound like something from a Looney Tunes cartoon, but it worked. The prisoners took the fake bomb out of the prison and they drove away with it. A nationwide manhunt ensued, and not surprisingly, the prisoners were all found in the end. Those are good examples of an elaborate escape. They took plenty of planning and, it has to be said, quite a lot of ambition. In the last case, the prison was left with egg on its face, so it soon changed things. One of those things was to lock up the men more, basically keeping them confined to their cells, at least if they were on death row. Other changes that happened was hiring extra staff and also installing more cameras. You might now be wondering if there was any maximum security prison that is just impossible to escape from. Imagine if a person has escaped before, maybe even numerous times before. What would you do with them? Dig a hole in the floor and throw them in it? Not quite. This isn't 1520, it's 2020. Prisoners have to have some rights. As for someone they just couldn't keep held down, we think the best example is a man named Richard Lee McNair. He escaped from prison 3 times, and one of those escapes, we kid you not, involved mailing himself out of the prison. The man was very intelligent, and he made a career out of escaping from prison. He also once bluffed a cop during an escape that has gone down in history as one of the most shameless lies ever caught on camera. So where do you put a man that can seemingly outfox the authorities when he wants and get out of prison with as much ease as Houdini removed a pair of handcuffs? The answer to the question is ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, aka the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This place has been called extreme in terms of just how secure it is. Journalists have walked through its halls and said they were spooked out. The reason for that is because the place is just so quiet. You can hear a pin drop in there. It looks less like a prison and more like a facility at the fictional SCP Foundation. It sits 5,000 feet above sea level at the foot of Colorado's southern Rockies. What does that tell you? It tells you that even if you could somehow get over the walls or dig under the ground, you'd stand out like a white rabbit running through the desert. There's literally nowhere to run. This is where McNair is now housed. It's where El Chapo spends all his time. It's where many of the most dangerous prisoners in the USA live, and the ones that show just a bit too much aptitude in prison escape class. A prisoner here will be housed according to their security level. It's all high security, but when you hold the likes of El Chapo, well, you can't be too careful. All prisoners will be on permanent lockdown, meaning 23 hours a day in a cell that is soundproof. That is so prisoners cannot chat with each other. In each cell, there isn't really anything you could fashion tools out of. The Spartan cells come with a bed, a stool, and a desk, all made out of poured concrete. There's a sink that doesn't have a tap that could be pulled off, and a shower that can't be used to flood the cell. That means no dragging officers in there in the night, getting them in the cell and hitting them with a tool a prisoner has made. Not gonna happen. There is a TV, but that's bolted inside the wall. Just for added torture, it plays mostly religious shows. It should be added that prisoners have no idea where they are in the facility because their only window to the world looks at the mountains and the sky. When prisoners leave their cells for recreation, they're handcuffed and often shackled, and then, with at least 2 officers, they're taken to the recreation area. This is not a yard, but more like a walled-up basketball court. Some inmates have been known to call them dog kennels. Another thing you need to know is that the officers there are very professional and they're paid well for what they do. Bribery is totally out of the question. The guards in the towers are equipped with precision rifles. It helps that they're all trained marksmen. If for some reason a prisoner should ever move freely around the prison, the CCTV technology is second to none, as are the pressure pads that a prisoner might step on and then set off an alarm. If an inmate ever got outside, they'd not only be faced with armed marksmen, but they'd have to scale a 12-foot tall razor wire fence. If they got over that, they'd have to run through the desert. You can't order a getaway car at ADX Florence. It would be spotted a long time before it got anywhere close to the prison. So how to get out? Simple hostage taking is impossible. The guards can't be bribed. How does a person come up with an elaborate plan when they're locked down most of the time and have no idea where they are in the prison? They're basically kept in a modern dungeon, something human rights activists aren't happy about, and the reason why quite a few inmates took their life when they got the chance. But so-called escape-proof prisons have been escaped from before. Could it happen again? The fact is, officers can become complacent, while inmates have all the time in the world to cook up a plan. They can't be denied visits from legal counsel, so they do have a way to communicate with the outside world. It's doubtful that any prisoner could escape after walking out of the cell door. Well, two doors, one with bars and another that is solid steel. Even if someone got outside of those, there are many other remote-controlled doors around the prison. There's just too much security. So we think an El Chapo type of escape wouldn't be in the cards. There is a golf course not too far away, and there's also a very small town with a population of 3,914. If there's any way of getting out of ADX, it would be getting to one of those places. Denver is almost 200 miles away, a city where a person could find some anonymity. But let's face it, a tunnel digging operation wouldn't be easy to do without being seen. It would have to be something out of a James Bond movie. We just don't think it would happen. In our humble opinion, if you go to ADX Florence, you stay there until you're told to move. For some inmates, their cell will feel much like a coffin. That's why one journalist described the place like this: the Supermax's life after death. It's long-term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than death. It was a prison within a detention center, within a British Army camp. It had barbed wire-topped fences over 15 feet high. Its concrete walls were so thick it would take an airstrike to penetrate them. Maze Prison was inescapable, until it wasn't. Opened in 1971, Maze Prison was created to house Irish Republican Army prisoners during the troubles that plagued Great Britain and Ireland in the late 20th century. The prison, however, quickly drew the ire of locals as the British enacted a policy of imprisonment without trial for anyone suspected of being part of the IRA. Shockingly, for a modern democratic nation, this policy would continue for 4 years until it was terminated in 1975. Designed to hold Britain's public enemies number one, Maze Prison consisted of several prison blocks or wings, which were each a self-contained prison. Prisoners never needed to leave one block to visit another for any reason, and movement within each was strictly limited and monitored by the prison staff. Each block was surrounded by an 18-foot concrete wall, and the entire prison complex was surrounded by a 15-foot fence topped with barbed wire. The walls of the prison were considered blast-proof. Given the IRA's penchant for making explosives, this was not an unreasonable precaution, and it would take a full-blown airstrike to penetrate each block's solid concrete walls. The gates leading in and out of each block and into the facility itself were all solid steel and controlled remotely by a control center at the center of the H formation that the prison complex formed. It was Europe's most escape-proof prison, but the IRA had something to say about that. The IRA viewed themselves as military combatants and not terrorists or political prisoners as the British government saw them. This meant that every IRA member housed within any British prison had the same duty as a military soldier did: escape at any cost. Luckily for the IRA inside the Maze Prison, they had the perfect man to lead the effort. Larry Marley had already been imprisoned once by the British in 1975, and while awaiting trial at a courthouse, he led 9 other IRA men to freedom. After being recaptured 2 years later and moved to Maze Prison, he nearly escaped again by dressing as a prison warden, even making it out of his prison block. He was found out just before escaping the final perimeter of security, though. Still seeking to escape from prison in 1983, Marley recruited IRA members Bobby Story, Jerry Kelly, and Brendan McFarlane. The men organized themselves like a military unit with Marley in command. Each prison block would have an escape officer in charge of his block's men, and each block also had an intelligence officer assigned to it, whose job was to learn as much about the prison layout and the guards as possible. Exactly like a military operation, information on the overall escape plan was at all times highly compartmentalized. Only those with a need to know were ever told the full details of the plan. Instead, each man involved below the commanding ranks knew only as much as they needed to in order to fulfill their role. This would ensure that if any of the men were captured, the likelihood of the plan being exposed would be greatly reduced. The first step was to learn the layout of the prison facility. Despite being imprisoned within, the men actually knew little about how the prison was laid out. The British authorities were extremely careful to keep the prisoners from discovering the layout of the prison, even moving prisoners between buildings in blacked-out vans. The escapees, however, would get around this lack of information by enlisting help from the outside. As they were still allowed visitation rights, family members would smuggle in aerial photographs printed in the media as well as ordnance survey maps. Now the prisoners knew where they were being held and which way led to freedom, but the next step of the plan might be even more difficult than the escape itself. For years, the IRA had conducted blanket protests within Maze Prison. seeing themselves as political prisoners and not normal criminals. They had for a long time been allowed special privileges and the right to not wear the standard prison uniform. Things changed in 1976, however, when the British government stripped these privileges away from IRA combatants, labeling them as common criminals. In outcry, IRA prisoners had refused to wear their uniforms and instead took to wearing their sleeping blankets instead. To further voice their dissent, they undertook several years of dirty protests within Mays Prison, with prisoners smearing the walls of their cells with their own excrement and attacking the guards with bodily fluids. This had left a deep enmity and open hatred between the guards and the prisoners, and if this prison escape was to succeed, the IRA had to change this relationship dramatically. The goal was to learn the weakness of each individual guard and how they might be best overcome or manipulated. Prisoners began to call guards by their first names and actively work to resolve conflicts between the guards and other prisoners in order to ingratiate themselves to the guards. They would chat about their shared love of football to the guards and even engage in small kindnesses like making tea for them while they were on their assigned duties. Despite resistance from other Irish nationalists in the prison, the plan slowly began to work. Many guards remained suspicious, but many more began to believe that they had at last broken their prisoners and began to slowly reveal small details of the function of the prison, such as when shift changes happened and when the prison was most busy. The improved behavior of the prisoners led the authorities to grant them special jobs, such as working as orderlies around the prison complex. This allowed the would-be escapees to better learn the layout of the prison complex, gain more information on the guards, and even afford them access to some of the control rooms. Sent to polish the floors and clean the general area, the escapees had full views of the security cameras and could learn even more details about the prison and, more importantly, what the cameras did or did not see. The kindness offensive was working to such a degree that prison guards even began to leave the door open to some of the control rooms, allowing air into the stuffy rooms. Armed with months of information, the commanding officers of the escape plan began to put their plan down on paper. They included all information they had on shift changes, patrol routes, camera blind spots, and most importantly, alarm points from where the guards could trigger an alarm. Then the plan was smuggled out of the prison and shown to IRA leadership on the outside, who would have the ultimate approval of the plan. Within days, the plan was approved, but the escapees would need help if they were to break out. 6 guns were smuggled into Mays Prison, and the exact way that they were smuggled remains an IRA secret to this day. The prisoners now had the intelligence and the means to take control of H7 block of the prison, but they still needed to figure out a way to penetrate the various layers of security between them and the outside world. Scaling the fences would be impossible, and even if they did, they would have to contend with armed British military guards outside who would shoot an escapee on sight. With no access to tools, an escape tunnel was impossible, and the thick concrete wall outside of H7 block couldn't be blasted open even if the IRA managed to smuggle explosives inside. The escapees quickly turned their attention to the food truck that brought their meals every day. The truck was frequently given free pass to enter and go without being searched, as the guards knew the sole driver of the truck very well by now. To their further advantage, the truck also routinely made stops at every one of Mays Prison's blocks. It was basically a free ticket outside of the prison. On the 25th of September 1983, the plan was put into action. September 25th was a Sunday, and chosen on purpose by the escapees. Sunday was a closed day, meaning no visits to the prison and no movement within it. All the prisoners remained in their blocks, and believing the prisoners to be secure, the guards typically relaxed. Without as much activity in the prison, the number of prison staff was also lower than usual. The escape began with Brendan McFarland scoping out the guards in the block. He needed 12 prison guard uniforms and needed to match 12 of the guards on duty with 12 of his men, ensuring the uniforms would fit them. Once he made his selections, McFarland began to shout for the use of a bumper, or the machine used to polish the prison floors. This was the go word, and the plan was launched into action. The IRA had forbidden the use of guns except unless strictly necessary, as they wished to portray themselves in a positive light to the media. Thus, shooting or even beating the guards was prohibited unless necessary, and the prisoners resorted to a shock and awe strategy of overwhelming the guards with verbal abuse. 4 guards were immediately captured in one room, prompting the beginning of the taking of 17 other guards outside. The prisoners had no way of communicating except line of sight, so one prisoner would overpower a guard as soon as he saw another prisoner begin his attack. The guards had to be overpowered within seconds of each other in order to prevent an alarm from being sounded. The group's biggest problem was prison officer John Adams, who sat inside the control room with easy access to a phone and alarm. A metal bar door barred their access to Adams, so Jerry Kelly was assigned to neutralize Adams with a gun. He slid the gun through the bars and pointed it at Adams, telling him not to move or touch any of the alarms. Then, an officer they hadn't expected exited the women's restroom outside the control room. The confusion briefly drew everyone's attention away and Adams lunged for the alarm. Kelly shot Adams twice, hitting him once right above the eye, A glancing blow, the impact knocked Adams unconscious for 30 seconds, but he quickly recovered. Bleeding from the injury, the prisoners wrapped his head up and then brought all the prison guards to a classroom where 12 were forced to strip. 12 of the IRA men put on the prison guard uniforms, and the guards then were read the following statement. "This is an IRA operation. We're not here for revenge or to punish you over the hunger strikes, but if you interfere with the escape, you'll be dealt with swiftly." In just 20 minutes, the IRA escapees had seized control of their prison block. Next was securing their ticket out of the prison facility. A half hour later, the food delivery truck arrived at H Block to deliver the evening's meals. The capture and coercion of the truck driver was vital to the plan's success, as the guards at the gates knew the driver's face well by now. Nobody could take his place, so securing his cooperation was vital. After being seized by the escapees, Bobby Story told the driver, "This block is now in the hands of the IRA. All screws who obeyed our orders are safe. One who didn't was shot in the head. We will shoot anyone who endangers our planned escape, including you." Then Story motioned at Jerry Kelly, the man who had shot Adams in the head. "That man will remain with you throughout the escape. He's doing 30 years and he'll shoot you without hesitation if he has to. He has nothing to lose." The truck was loaded with 37 prisoners, and Kelly slid into the footwell of the front seats, pointing his gun at the driver the whole time. Kelly added to his threats, telling the driver that a grenade had been placed under his seat and would explode if he attempted anything funny. Given the circumstances, the driver was inclined to believe him. They had their ride out, but they still had to make their way out of 3 separate gates. To do so, they need to take over the control room of the main gate, known as the Tally Lodge. The 12 prisoners disguised as guards entered the control room and began to secure the officers inside, while Kelly remained in the truck with a gun on the driver. To make their escape successful, some inmates would have to remain in the control room to watch over the guards, sacrificing their freedom for their compatriots. All was going to plan until a guard pressed a secret, silent alarm. A few moments later, the phone rang. The prisoners grabbed the senior officer and, with a gun to his head, told him to answer the phone, warning that if he said anything wrong, they'd kill him. The prison's emergency control room was calling in response to the silent alarm, asking if everything was all right. The officer laughed it off, saying that one of the other guards had accidentally pressed the alarm. He was warned to tell his men to stop horsing around and reset the alarm. The escape had been going perfectly, but numerous small delays had messed up the IRA's timetable. The 12 prisoners dressed as guards who would stay behind to secure the others' escape were in the control room, with the other 38 in the truck below. Running late, the prisoners were forced to wait now as a shift change occurred, and incoming guards were promptly seized by the prisoners in the control tower. However, being very quickly outnumbered, the guards eventually began to fight back. The main gate was opened, but 2 officers wedged their cars into the gate, blocking it. The men in the truck rushed out and began fighting with the officers who had freed themselves. A British Army soldier in the watchtower above watched in confusion as the scene unfolded, later saying that he didn't open fire because he couldn't tell who was who, as many of the escapees were dressed as guards. In fact, he believed the guards were actually fighting amongst themselves. With the plan in tatters, the IRA escapees rushed to the final gate and climbed over it as the guards gave chase. They opened fire on the guards as they ran, wounding one in the leg. With a mad dash to freedom, 35 of the escapees managed to climb the final gate, with 3 getting recaptured. The IRA was supposed to be waiting with a vehicle convoy, but again, due to bad timing, nobody awaited the prisoners, who were forced to run for it on foot or hijack any passing cars. Ultimately, the escape would only leave a single guard dead, Officer James Ferris, who suffered a heart attack after being stabbed. 20 officers would suffer injuries, with 4 being stabbed and 2 shot. 15 of the escapees were immediately recaptured by authorities on the very same day, with the rest fleeing across the border to Ireland. This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Use our link in the description below for a 30-day trial, giving you unlimited access to thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers when you use the code INFOGRAPHICS. By 1962, there had been 12 escape attempts at America's most notorious prison, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, and all of them had failed. The authorities believed they had finally created a lockup that no man could escape from. After all, the prison sat on an island just off the city of San Francisco, and even if a person breached the walls, they'd still have to swim through choppy waters to get to land. And then in 1962, some men went missing from their cells after hatching an elaborate escape plan. These guys vanished into thin air, but subsequent investigations ruled that they must have died in the water. "There's no egg on our faces," said the authorities. Well, that might not be true, and a recent letter could be proof of that. It all began on June 11, 1962, when 4 men went missing from their cells. They were Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, Alan West, and Frank Morris. The 2 guys with the same last name were brothers, and they were true tough guys in the physical sense. In their childhood, they were very strong swimmers, and they liked nothing more than to swim in Lake Michigan, even when the water was very cold. Now where should we imprison a couple of brothers who love swimming through ice-cold water? Anyway, If the two brothers were strong, Morris could equal them in brains. He had a high IQ and he was the one who formulated the escape plan. With homemade tools, including sharpened spoons, the guys started digging around a ventilation vent. That vent was too small to crawl into, so they had to widen the hole. They did this over weeks while Morris would play an accordion to drown out the scraping sound. As the hole got bigger, they placed over it a piece of cardboard that looked just like the wall. They knew very well that once they were able to get through the hole, they could reach a utility tunnel. This became a kind of storeroom. Those guys knew very well that even if they did get over the wall, they'd have to get through the water. So they spent months building a raft and they hid it in that tunnel. This raft was created by sticking together around 50 raincoats they had stolen. They used a heating process to make the thing airtight so the raft could be blown up and could float. They also made paddles so they could get themselves to land and to freedom. Of course, if the guards saw men missing from their cells, they would immediately blow the whistle and the game would be up. But the men created dummies that looked like real people. They even used hair they collected from the prison barbers to stick on the dummies' heads. The heads themselves were made out of cement and then painted to give the appearance of human skin. On the night of the escape, the man called West didn't get very far at all. He couldn't get the grill off his vent and he ended up going nowhere. The fact that he remained behind is why we know so much about the escape. The other guys in short got to a roof, then over the fences. They had their raft intact but needed to blow it up, and that's not easy for human beings. But the guys had another useful tool. They used the accordion as a kind of pump. So what next? Well, they weren't seen again. Bits of the raft were found, but the men's bodies were never discovered, and let's face it, if they had drowned, surely one of them would have been found. But no, nothing. They were gone. And it's not like every bit of water wasn't scanned for a long time to come. It wasn't until 1979 that the FBI closed the case. Those guys must have died, said the FBI, and that's that, we're closing the book. But you know what? A lot of people didn't believe those guys had died that night. Their escape was a victory to some criminals. Movies were made about their daring escape, and people wanted to believe that they'd been successful. There were some sightings of the fellas from time to time, but no identification has been conclusive. Some people say that one of the Anglin brothers even attended a funeral, but we can't say for sure if that's true. Then in 2013, a bombshell was dropped. This is the famous letter that was allegedly written by none other than John Anglin. While the cops got a hold of it in 2013, its existence to the public didn't become known until 2018. This is how it went. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. The letter goes on to say that the brains of the operation, Frank Morris, died in 2008. But the brothers lived on and did so in the US. Clarence apparently died in 2011, though it seems that John Anglin wanted to come clean since he was so sick. The letter also includes this: if you announce on TV that I'll be promised to just go to jail for no more than a year and get medical attention, I'll write back to let you know exactly where I am. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. The authorities didn't follow up on the letter, and it's not clear why. It seems they did reopen the case, but contact with the letter writer was never made. Whoever wrote the letter hasn't come forward again. John would be 89 now. Surely if a man is in his 80s and about to die, then he would step out into the light. If you're on your own deathbed, then you likely don't need to hide from the police, but John hasn't appeared. Did he even contact his family to perhaps say goodbye to them? Well, a nephew of the brothers said this to the media: it's always been talked about through the family. My grandmother received roses for several years after the escape, but still no John. Even if that nephew knew for a fact that John had escaped, surely after his death the family would have told all and even allowed some DNA tests, but no body has ever been found. By the way, the letter was analyzed for DNA, but the results were inconclusive. People who have written extensively about this case say that if they really did escape and live long lives, surely someone in this world would know. If Morris really did die in 2008, surely someone from his family would have said something. Where's his body? Was there a funeral? Still, the bodies weren't found in the water either, and we know that athletes swim through that water. Those two brothers with their strong swimming skills could have made it, is what many people think. Others say they all drowned, and the reason their bodies were never recovered is because they were swept into the Pacific Ocean. Dutch researchers a few years ago created simulations of the movements of waters that night, and their conclusion was that on that raft those guys could have escaped. Still, that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't swept away. We looked to see if anything else came up after that letter was sent, and there is nothing. For that reason, we think that it's unlikely that the letter was written by John. In his death throes, he would have told someone who he was, and we would have heard about it. It just makes no sense that the letter is real. Although we won't say that the men didn't escape and just kept their heads down their entire lives. Maybe you disagree. We want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. We know you love to learn just as much as we do, and there's no better place to get the highest quality documentaries and nonfiction titles than on the streaming service created for those with a lifelong quest to learn, explore, and understand. We just watched How to Build a Castle, and not only did we learn a ton, now we're ready to build one of our own. With thousands of videos across science, nature, history, and more, you'll never run out of new topics to explore. You can get unlimited access for just $2.99 a month or $19.99 a year. And for viewers of the Infographics Show, the first 30 days are completely free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/infographics and use the code INFOGRAPHICS. Alcatraz Island, one of the most secure prisons ever built. This maximum security federal penitentiary was located in San Francisco Bay to hold the worst of the worst. If anyone was going to get past the elite prison security, they would find themselves facing a perilous 2-mile swim to shore in choppy waters. The prison was considered inescapable, with everyone who tried either being quickly recaptured or sinking to their death in the water below. Escapes had a 0% success rate, at least until June 11, 1962. Here is the story of what unfolded on that mysterious date, day by day. October 12, 1933. The island had been in the hands of the federal government for decades, and it had a familiar purpose. It was a prison. The Army had used it as a disciplinary barracks, and the isolated location was an ideal place for disobedient or reckless soldiers to take stock of themselves and reflect before being transferred back to their unit or dishonorably discharged. But it was also a barracks, not a maximum security penitentiary, and the government had no use for the standing prison when they acquired the land. They wanted to build something much more intimidating, and it would take almost a year to complete. August 11, 1934. The Federal Bureau of Prisons had spent the last year modernizing the place and turning it into one of the government's most secure prisons. It even had one of the first metal detectors ever added to a prison and radio equipment to keep contact with the mainland. Now all that was left to do was fill the prison with people it was intended for, and they had a specific population in mind. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was meant for the worst of the worst, the most dangerous criminals and the ones who kept getting into trouble at other prisons. It was designed as the end of the line. This was the day that the first boatload of prisoners would arrive on Alcatraz Island, transferred there from the infamous federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. Most were bank robbers, murderers, and even a few counterfeiters were mixed up in there. Within the next few weeks, hundreds more would arrive, and by the next year, the prison would have almost 250 inmates. It would soon gain a reputation as the toughest prison in America, with inmate fights and even murders happening regularly. But the Bureau of Prisons was mostly fine with that, as long as the inmates stayed where they belonged, on Alcatraz. And they did, but not for lack of trying. April 27, 1936. It wouldn't be long before inmates tried to escape from Alcatraz, and the first was convicted armed robber Joseph Bowers. The prisoner was on trash duty at the incinerator when he made a run for the chain-link fence leading to the shore. He was quickly cornered by the guards, ordered to stop, and when he continued to climb, he was shot and died from his injuries in the fall. He did get off Alcatraz Island, just not the way he was hoping. But the hope for freedom is eternal, and soon another prisoner tried to make a break for the shoreline. December 16, 1937. It's important to learn from mistakes, and Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe did not intend to wind up like Bowers. The two bank robbers knew each other from Oklahoma, and both were in Alcatraz because of their past escape attempts. These two had a much more effective escape attempt, filing through iron bars and sneaking out of the prison workshop on a foggy day when they wouldn't be seen by the guard towers. They leapt into the waters below, and the strong currents carried them away quickly, never to be seen again. While their bodies were never found, they never got near the shore, and it's extremely unlikely they could have survived. But just because you learn from past failures doesn't mean you succeed. January 13, 1939. There had been plenty of escape attempts in the years since, but none of them went anywhere. Prisoners would attack guards, break windows, and climb the roof, but they were all caught. The next prisoners to make a real run of it were a fivesome: Arthur Doc Barker, William Martin, Rufus McCain, Henry Young, and Dale Stamphill. They were all kept in the prison's most secure unit as a motley crew of gang leaders and bank robbers. One night they managed to escape the prison and head to the shore, and they were smart enough not to try to swim for it. They attempted to build a makeshift raft, and time ran out. They were cornered by the guards. Their ringleader, Barker, was killed immediately, and the rest wound up in solitary confinement with a lot of time to reflect on their mistakes. But others would improve on their mistakes. April 14, 1943. There had been more escape attempts since, with one man even getting into the water and then quickly swimming back to the shore once he realized he was going to drown. But 4 men would soon get closer than anyone had. James Borman, Harold Marin Brest, Floyd Garland Hamilton, and Fred John Hunter planned their escape well. They cut window bars in the prison workshop and made flotation devices out of cans. After overpowering 2 guards and leaving them bound and gagged, they escaped, but could only take 2 of the 4 cans through the window. One of the guards got loose, blew a whistle, and alerted the other guards. 1 was shot, 1 was apprehended, and the other 2 hid out in a small cave on the island before they were found, bringing their escape attempts to an anticlimactic end. But maybe they were working harder, not smarter. July 31, 1945. John K. Giles was one of Alcatraz's more unassuming inmates, but he was actually a cold-blooded murderer and a train robber. He was transferred to Alcatraz after several escape attempts and wasted no time getting up to his old tricks. He knew swimming to shore was a no-go, so he spent time collecting pieces of an army uniform from the laundry room until he had a full uniform. At that point, he impersonated a soldier and boarded a ferry that would take him back to the mainland. The only problem? He probably wasn't the only person to think of that, and before departing, the ship's captain checked the passenger list and found they had 1 extra. Giles was discovered and sent right back into Alcatraz, making him the closest to an actual escapee so far. And things were about to hit a boiling point. May 2nd to the 4th, 1946. No one had been able to get off Alcatraz Island yet, but 6 hardened criminals weren't going to let that stop them. Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, and Miriam Thompson were all serving long sentences when they overpowered correction officers and took control of a cell house. That gave them access to 2 things no previous escapees ever had: weapons and keys. They planned to steal a boat and head back to shore, but they soon discovered the keys to the outside door weren't included in the set, maybe to prevent this exact situation. So they decided to fight it out. In what would become known as the Battle of Alcatraz, they took 2 guards hostage and both wound up dead. 3 of the criminals retreated back to their cells while the others stood their ground against U.S. Marines and were all killed. Maybe Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson hoped that they'd be able to avoid blame if they went back to their cells, but all 3 were put on trial for murder of the guards and 2 went to the gas chamber, while the youngest, Carnes, was given a second life sentence. It was clear how bad things had gotten, and the authorities were going to crack down. September 28, 1958. There had been only 2 recorded escape attempts in the 12 years after the Battle of Alcatraz, with 1 criminal managing to get out of the prison but just wandered around on the rocks after he realized he had no way to get to the mainland. Then on September 29, 1958, 2 inmates hoped it was their time for success. Aaron Burgett and Clyde Johnson overpowered a guard and jumped into the water using improvised flotation devices, including plastic bags they hoped would float and wooden boards that they thought would work as fins. It made a little sense, but it didn't really work out. Johnson was quickly nabbed by the police and Burgett drowned in the attempt. It seemed all but impossible to get off Alcatraz. Don't tell that to these guys. Let's wind the clock back a little, because 4 inmates were about to take Alcatraz by storm. 1957. Alan West was up to no good. The New York City-born had been arrested over 20 times through his life, and he was only 28 years old. He was currently serving an extended sentence for car theft at Florida State Prison, but his attempt to escape there put him on the government's radar, and he was soon sent to Alcatraz, becoming inmate AZ-1335. He spent the first few years there in relative obscurity, but he was about to get company. January 20th, 1960. Frank Morris had a rough life, being abandoned by his parents when he was 11, but he went into the system and was shuffled from one foster home to another, then got involved in crime by the time he was a teenager. By the time he was on the cusp of adulthood, he was notorious for drug possession, armed robbery, and any other crime that was easy to pull off. As an adult, he would escalate and begin stealing cars and robbing banks, which would lead him to the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He was serving a 10-year hitch when he escaped and was apprehended while committing a burglary. On January 20th, 1960, it would be Alcatraz for the crafty crook, who had reportedly had an IQ of 133, making him one of the smartest people in the prison system. But 2 minds are better than 1. January 10th, 1961. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, never had to worry about being alone. They were 2 of 13 children born to a family of farm workers who moved frequently. The 2 brothers were close and were expert swimmers, but they also had questionable judgment, starting with Clarence breaking into a gas station as a teenager. By their 20s, they were robbing banks and businesses, and they were good at their job. They usually targeted closed businesses and rarely used guns. But when they robbed a bank in Alabama, they were hit with 35-year sentences. They tried to escape multiple times, so it was off to Alcatraz for the Bad News Brothers on January 10, 1961. But the prison didn't realize these 4 ingredients would make for an explosive mix. December 1961. The 4 inmates may have had very different backstories, but they all had met each other during the previous stays at prison in Florida and Georgia. And when they were placed in adjacent cells during their time in Alcatraz, it was like a class reunion. This gave them a lot of time to plan, and that's exactly what they did. Frank Morris, the most ambitious and ruthless of the criminals, took the leadership role and would spend the next 6 months carefully carving out an escape scheme. Literally. So how did they pull this off under the nose of the guards? For one thing, Alcatraz is big, and the whole thing can't be guarded at any given moment. As long as the prisoners are in their cells, the guards are likely to leave them alone. Most escapes have started from the prison workshop or yard anyway, and that's what gave these 4 their opening. They would collect scrap blades from saws that they found in the prison workshops and smuggle them back to their cells. They would also steal metal spoons from the cafeteria, and they even managed to improvise an electric drill from the motor of a vacuum cleaner. And slowly but surely they would widen the ventilation duct in their cell until it was big enough to squeeze through. So how did these months of work go undetected? These crafty cons thought of everything, using the supplies from the prison workshop to paint cardboard that would cover the ventilation ducts, and as for the noise their work would cause, they had a plan for that too. Frank Morris loved to play the accordion, and as we all know, an enthusiastic accordion player can empty a room in a hurry. There was a designated music hour at Alcatraz, and Morris would play his heart out, while his partners in crime would work themselves to the bone. And their plan had one more surprise. They would need a lot of supplies to get away, and they didn't just try to assemble them in their cells. The vent ducts would lead to the top of the cell block, which was vacant. There, in the dead of night, when no one was watching, they would set up a workshop far out of sight and use a collection of supplies they had stolen. They were building life preservers, a far more effective way of surviving the raging rapids surrounding the island than a standard raft or just swimming for it. And the source of many of these ideas, Popular Mechanics magazine, which would no doubt be banned at Alcatraz in short order. And there was one more surprise in store for the guards right out of Hollywood. These 4 men were master craftsmen, and they knew that they'd need as big a head start as possible. Most of the past escapees were eventually tracked down, so these guys used their supplies to craft papier-mâché heads of themselves out of soap, toothpaste, concrete, and toilet paper. They then put the heads at the front of each of their beds, piled blankets and clothing under the covers, and made it look like they were sleeping there. A common trick that teenagers use when sneaking out of the house, but not nearly this effective. It was time to make their move. June 11, 1962. It was time to escape, but there would be problems from the start. The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris slipped through their corridors and into the ventilation shaft, but Alan West found his construction had a problem. He had used cement to shore up his corridor and it was hardened, making it just a little too narrow for him to slide through. He had to do an impromptu construction job, and by the time he got through, the other 3 had departed, so rather than try to go it alone, he went back to his cell and fell asleep. The other 3 would have a more exciting night. The trio planned to escape through the unguarded utility corridor, and it was empty as they knew it would be. They then entered the ventilation shaft and climbed onto the roof. Guards who were interviewed after the escape attempt said they heard a loud bang but decided not to investigate. The trio carried their life preservers and raft with them, slid down a kitchen ventilation pipe, and made their way to the grounds. Now there was just one thing standing between them and freedom: 2 12-foot barbed wire fences. No biggie, right? They got over the fence, likely a painful ordeal, and worked their way to the northeast shoreline of Alcatraz Island. This was near the power plant powering the prison, which was a small blind spot in the island's security network. Hiding from the massive number of searchlights and towers with armed guards, they inflated their raft with an accordion-like device called a concertina they had stolen from an inmate. That's right, for the second time, accordions were responsible for the best Alcatraz escape attempt of all time. It was now around 10 p.m., and it was now or never. The 3 men boarded their raft with the safety equipment they had designed and launched it into the rough waters. Their goal was nearby Angel Island, an island 2 miles away. While it had been used as an immigration station previously, the island was mostly unspoiled wilderness and was the ideal place to hide out and plan their next move to the mainland, if they got there. They had 2 miles of choppy water to get through on a makeshift raft, something that no other escapee had ever survived. So, did they make it? We don't know, because Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were never seen again, alive or dead. June 12, 1962. It was morning and all seemed quiet at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. All the prisoners were sleeping, but 3 of them didn't rouse when woken up. A quick investigation of the cells ensued, and the dummy heads and ventilation ductwork were finally discovered. An exhaustive search of the prison ensued, and none of the trio were found anywhere. Federal authorities were called in to comb the area for any sign of escapees. After all, Alcatraz was inescapable, wasn't it? June 14, 1962. The investigators had found nothing for 2 days, but the Coast Guard finally had some luck, picking up a paddle around 200 yards off the coast of Angel Island. Was it debris from a wrecked raft or a remnant of a successful escape attempt? A look around the island found a wallet belonging to one of the Anglin brothers, but no sign of the trio could be found. the remnants of the escape would continue to be found. June 21, 1962. Near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, shreds of what would later be identified as a raincoat were found floating in the water. Raincoats were one of the materials used to build the raft, and this led the authorities to believe that the men likely had drowned, especially after a deflated life jacket was found the next day. But that was the last bit of physical evidence found by the authorities. July 17, 1962. The SS Norefjell, a Norwegian ship, was sailing into San Francisco harbor when it spotted what looked like a body in the water. They weren't on the hunt for men and didn't report it until later, but many had speculated that it could have been Morris or one of the Englands. However, authorities said it was unlikely a body would still be floating on the surface a full month after the escape. A man had died in a plunge from the Golden Gate Bridge only days before, so all this did was add to the mystery. Fortunately, the authorities had another source. When West's cell was tossed in the aftermath, his role was discovered, but he technically hadn't tried to escape and wasted no time telling the authorities everything he knew, so he didn't wind up being charged. With no confirmation of what had happened, the FBI put out wanted posters and offered rewards for the trio, while acknowledging they were likely dead. But just because no one knew if they survived, that didn't mean it wouldn't inspire others. December 16, 1962. Surely a possibly successful escape attempt would mean a crackdown on the prisoners, right? Maybe not, because it would be less than 6 months until the next escape attempt, and this one also improved on the last guy's. John Paul Scott, serving 30 years for bank robbery, created a pair of water wings for himself out of inflated rubber gloves and used them to bolster him as he swam to shore. He made it to the Golden Gate Bridge, where he immediately collapsed from exhaustion and hypothermia. Turns out, swimming 2 miles in December was not a great idea, and after a hospital stay, he was returned to Alcatraz. But there would be one other casualty of the escape attempt. March 21, 1963. Yes, Morris and the Englands were likely dead, but no one could prove it, and that was a massive black eye for the inescapable Alcatraz Island. With the prison no longer looking as foolproof as it did before, the government turned a closer eye to it and discovered that it was a disaster. The isolated prison was very expensive to run, costing more than 3 times as much per inmate as a federal prison in Atlanta. Additionally, being a prison on an island surrounded by salt water took its toll, and much of the prison's construction had eroded. Massive repairs would be needed. But instead, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy chose to close the prison, and today was its last day. Most of Alcatraz's inmates were lifers or had decades on their sentence, and they'd be transferred back to the mainland. In the end, everyone did escape Alcatraz, including Allen West, just not the way they'd hoped. But there were a few other postscripts to the whole affair. 1978. Allen West had a rough time before his stay on Alcatraz, and it continued after. He was transferred to different highly secured prisons before being released in 1967 and was arrested a year later for grand larceny. While in Florida State Prison, he murdered another inmate and died in prison of peritonitis in 1978, bringing an end to the story of the Alcatraz 4. Or did it? December 31, 1979. It had been 17 years since the escape, and the FBI was ready to close its file. No further evidence had been found since the days after the escape, but enough of the raft had been found that the FBI believed the men had drowned after the raft fell apart, and their bodies were likely swept out to sea. However, tips continued to pour in claiming sightings of the 3 men, making them the predecessors to the legendary plane hijacker D.B. Cooper. While the case was closed, the U.S. Marshal's file on the men remains open, and rewards are available for their capture. The story will only officially close in 2030, as the men would all be 100 years old and likely dead.